a master of deception, skilled at hiding his every move. He's about to play his most dangerous game yet. But this time, an unseen hand is watching his every step. The truth is on the verge of being revealed, and every move he makes leads him closer to his own downfall. Will this be his end? Or is there someone even more elusive, hiding a secret darker than his own? The Hotel Côte de Brume stood like a forgotten sentinel atop the battered cliffs, its once gleaming facade dulled by salt-laden winds, its windows staring blankly out at the endless grey churn of the Atlantic, a place where the violence of nature clashed with the stubborn remnants of human grandeur. Visitors came in hesitant trickles, drawn by the promise of isolation and the haunting beauty of the landscape, a terrain shaped by centuries of relentless wind, raging tides, and whispered tragedies. Narrow cobbled streets wound through the nearby village like veins through a dying limb, carrying murmurs of the past, tales of ships that vanished without a cry, of treasure lost forever beneath storm-lashed waves, of spectral figures glimpsed through the mist when the sun slipped beneath the horizon. Yet Hercule Poirot, a man whose soul was stitched with logic, and whose heart beat to the rhythm of reason, dismissed such ghost stories with the faintest of smiles, believing firmly in the primacy of order over chaos. And still as he sat that evening, in the hotel's grand but fading lounge, the edges of reality seemed to fray around him. The muted glow of the dying fire, the muted scent of damp wood and time-worn leather, the creak of ancient timbers whispering under unseen pressure, all conspired to plant a seed of disquiet he could not easily dismiss. The hotel itself, once a gleaming refuge for the affluent, bore its decline with a weary sort of grace. The heavy drapes sagged slightly at their seams. The polished floors bore scars that no amount of buffing could erase, and the chandeliers overhead, though magnificent, had lost the fevered brilliance of their youth. But it was not decay that troubled Poirot. It was the intangible, the sense of a presence just beyond the reach of sight, the feeling of being watched not with malice, but with a heavy expectant patience. Madame Morel, the steely-eyed proprietress, ran the establishment with ruthless precision masked by genteel manners, and even she, Poirot observed, seemed subtly out of tune tonight, her eyes flickering with quick furtive glances toward the darkened hallway, as though expecting something or someone to emerge. Poirot, having taken residence at the Côte de Brume 3 days earlier, in a rare concession to rest, had spent his days wandering the rugged cliffs, the salt spray lashing his face, and dining on hearty rustic meals that sang of the sea. Yet each evening, as shadows lengthened, and the mist rolled up from the water like ghostly fingers, an invisible pressure seemed to build within the hotel's walls. At precisely 11 that night, as the grandfather clock by the hearth gave its slow sonorous toll, a strange disturbance shattered the hush, a deliberate, measured tread upon the upper corridor, distinct against the aching silence. Footsteps, slow and rhythmic, moving with the certainty of one who knew exactly where they were going, but with a cadence that suggested no haste, no urgency, only purpose. Poirot stiffened, setting his delicate porcelain cup down with surgical care, every nerve drawn taut. The footsteps emanated from the vicinity of room 13, a room that had been Madame Morel, assured him just that afternoon, sealed off for repairs, unoccupied, its shutters bolted, and its key supposedly locked away. Yet here now was the unmistakable sound of presence, of movement, where none should be. The pacing continued, an unsettling metronome, for long minutes that seemed to stretch the fabric of time thin, before halting in an abrupt, almost expectant silence. Poirot, heart hammering with the cold thrill of something out of place, strained his ears, catching the faint decisive click of a key turning in a lock, a sound so ordinary, yet here so profoundly wrong. And then from within that forsaken room, a scream sharp, ragged, and filled with such raw terror that it seemed to claw at the walls themselves. ripped through the night. Before the last echo faded, Poirot was already moving, propelled by instinct as much as intellect, even as doors burst open up and down the corridor. Sleepy, disheveled guests stumbling into the dim light, their faces pale, their eyes wide with bewildered fear. Madame Morel, her usual composure shredded into something wild and frantic, came rushing from the other end, pointing with a trembling hand toward room 13, her voice a broken whisper. It came from there, and for a heartbeat, all stood frozen, the guests in their hastily donned nightclothes, the long hallway cloaked in trembling shadows, the heavy unmoving door of room 13, like a sealed tomb, and in that suspended breath, Poirot understood, the Côte de Brume was not merely haunted by old legends. Something real, something alive stirred within its ancient bones, and reason alone might not be enough to survive the darkness that was about to unfold. Seconds ticked by in thick, breathless silence before Madame Fournier, her face pale but determined, produced a heavy ring of keys from her trembling pocket. Her fingers, usually so swift and certain, now fumbled awkwardly as she selected the right one, each metallic clink against the others echoing unnervingly down the corridor. And as Hercule Poirot watched her with sharpened focus, he recognized the rare sight of genuine fear, in a woman whose ironclad composure seldom cracked. With a soft click that seemed deafening in the hush, the key turned, and the door to room 7 creaked open on reluctant hinges, releasing a dense musty darkness into the hallway, the heavy curtains inside still drawn tight against the world beyond. Poirot stepped forward, his sharp gaze sweeping over the untouched furnishings, the neatly made bed, the chairs aligned just so, the mirror unblemished, yet a wrongness clung to the air, faint but undeniable, like the metallic tang of old blood, or something more ancient and malignant. His nostrils flared slightly as he caught the scent, his instincts bristling, and then his eyes, ever precise, dropped to the floor where a single object broke the room's frozen perfection. A handkerchief, fragile and lacy, and beside it, half hidden by the spill of dim hallway light, a dark stain had begun to seep hungrily into the carpet fibers. Kneeling smoothly, Poirot touched a gloved finger to the stain, lifting it briefly to his nose before straightening, his face a mask of unreadable calculation as he murmured, "Madame Fournier, summon the police at once. There has been violence here." A collective gasp rose behind him as the gathered guests, who had crept nearer out of morbid curiosity, recoiled as if the bloodstain itself might leap toward them, their whispers fluttering like uneasy birds in the stale air. Still Poirot remained composed, brushing invisible dust from the sleeves of his dressing gown, his mind already sifting through 1,000 possibilities, each darker than the last, as he cast one final glance around the eerily untouched room, noting tiny details, the slight shift of a chair leg, the subtle depression in the carpet near the bed, signs of movement invisible to the untrained eye. Yes, room 7 held secrets buried deep beneath its carefully maintained surface, secrets that had awakened tonight under cover of mist and silence, and Hercule Poirot was determined to uncover them, no matter what malevolence might be waiting in the darkened halls of the Hôtel de Revenant. As the guests huddled closer, their faces taut with fear, and the heavy tick of the hallway clock marking the slow passage of a dreadful night, Poirot knew with chilling certainty that the crime was only the beginning, and that whatever ancient shadow had been stirred would not rest easily again. Madame Fournier's fingers trembled ever so slightly as she fumbled for the ring of keys in her pocket. Her usual precision, honed through years of managing the hotel, was betrayed by an almost imperceptible wave of unease. Poirot's observant eyes missed nothing. She hesitated for a brief second, as if uncertain before selecting the key she sought with an almost desperate flick of her hand. The key slid into the lock with a quiet, almost reluctant click, and the door creaked open, releasing a wave of thick darkness into the hallway. The air felt heavy, weighed down by an oppressive silence, as though the very walls of room 7 were holding their breath. Poirot stepped into the room without hesitation, his eyes immediately narrowing, his mind already calculating, processing, and dismissing what little the scene before him offered. At first glance, the room seemed untouched. Everything in its place. The bed meticulously made, the curtains drawn tight, the furnishings undisturbed. Yet there was something in the atmosphere that felt wrong, an invisible tension threading through the air that made his skin prickle. The faint metallic scent, lingering in the room, hung thickly, almost cloyingly, and Poirot's sharp eyes instinctively dropped to the floor, where a small delicate handkerchief lay abandoned at the foot of the bed, white as snow and oddly pristine amidst the disarray. But it was not the handkerchief that caught his attention. It was the dark stain seeping into the carpet beside it. It spread slowly, silently, like a slow burn, and Poirot's breath caught ever so slightly. Without a word, he dropped to one knee, his movements precise, deliberate, as his fingers brushed lightly against the stain. He brought them to his nose, his sharp mind immediately identifying the unmistakable scent of blood, fresh, metallic, and unmistakably real. His face remained unreadable, a study of calm even as the realization settled in his gut like a stone. This was no accident. This was a crime. His gaze flickered to Madame Fournier, who stood behind him, frozen, her face pale as if she had seen a ghost. With a firm, commanding voice, Poirot spoke. "Madame Fournier, summon the police immediately. We are dealing with something much more sinister here than you realize." Her hands shook as she fumbled for the telephone, her eyes darting nervously between him and the scene in front of her. A gasp rose from the gathered guests, breaking the heavy silence. The sound was like a spark in dry tinder, setting off a wave of anxious murmurs. Nervous glances were exchanged, some guests instinctively pulling their robes tighter around them as though the chill of the unknown was pressing in on them from all sides. But Poirot remained unfazed, his posture unwavering as he stood, adjusting the cuffs of his dressing gown with an almost eerie calm. His mind, however, was anything but calm. It was already racing, processing the details. The blood, the handkerchief, the unease in the air, the quiet dread that lingered like a fog in the room. Something was amiss, and he intended to uncover every last detail of it, no matter where it led. His eyes swept over the room once more, lingering briefly on each of the faces in the hallway. He noted the subtle tension in their postures, the way some guests tried to seem indifferent, their eyes flickering to the scene before quickly darting away. The unease was palpable, but Poirot's gaze sharpened as he turned to them. He knew the first step in solving any mystery was not just to observe the crime scene, but to observe the reactions of those who were present. They were all potential witnesses or suspects, and every subtle shift in their expressions was a clue waiting to be uncovered. "Madame Fournier," he said calmly, "who was the last person to occupy this room?" Madame Fournier hesitated, her eyes shifting nervously to the others, before finally answering, her voice almost a whisper. "A gentleman, Monsieur Felix Rabineau. He stayed here for 3 nights, and left suddenly, about a week ago." Poirot's brow furrowed. "Left suddenly," he echoed, the question laced with suspicion. "Yes," Madame Fournier replied, her hands wringing together nervously. "He was supposed to stay longer, but he left in the early hours of the morning. It was strange. He seemed agitated. He paid his bill in full, and left without saying a word to anyone." She paused, then added, "Since then no one has stayed in this room. I was going to have it cleaned before the next guest arrived, but we've been short-staffed this week." Poirot's mind raced as he absorbed the information. A sudden departure, a man who seemed agitated, paying in full and leaving without a trace. There was something deeply unsettling about it all. His eyes narrowed as he turned to the rest of the guests, their faces betraying various degrees of nervousness. Some were watching him closely, others simply stared at the door to the room as though it might reveal its secrets if they only stared long enough. Poirot could feel the weight of their eyes, each of them wondering if the mystery was about to unfold before them, or if they were about to be drawn deeper into something far darker than they had anticipated. "This is most curious," Poirot murmured to himself, almost as though he was speaking to the shadows in the room. A locked room, a pool of blood, and yet no body, No sign of struggle. No immediate cause. Yes, this is no accident. It's a deliberate act. And the game, as they say, has only just begun. The distant sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the hall as Madame Fournier returned, flustered but determined. "The police are on their way," she said, her voice breathless. "They'll be here within the hour." Poirot nodded slightly, his eyes flickering with approval. "Excellent. Now, Madame Fournier, I must ask who else had access to this room besides you and the housekeeping staff." She hesitated again, as if weighing the gravity of the question. "Only myself, and the housekeeping staff," she admitted. "I locked the room personally after Monsieur Rabineau's departure." Poirot considered her words carefully, his mind already piecing together the clues, secrets hidden beneath the surface. Things left unsaid, things that would reveal themselves in time. He was certain now of one thing. The truth was buried in this room, and he would stop at nothing to unearth it. The guests, standing on edge, were as much a part of this mystery as the blood-stained carpet and the locked door. He would watch them, listen to them, study every movement, every glance, and in the end the truth would come to light. The night had only just begun, and Poirot knew one thing with certainty. A storm was coming, and he would be ready to face it head-on. Madame Fournier stood frozen at the doorway, her breath caught in her throat, as Poirot stepped into the room. He had been certain from the very moment he arrived. Room 7 held a crime, and where there was a crime there were always clues. One only needed to know where to look. The room itself, though modestly furnished, seemed almost too ordinary. An oak bed positioned with care, a writing desk near the window, a faded armchair tucked in the corner. The heavy curtains were drawn, blocking out the moonlight, and the scent of old wood mingled with the faintest hint of lavender, filling the air like a forgotten memory. But it was the floor that drew Poirot's attention. A dark stain of blood had begun to seep into the carpet near the foot of the bed. It wasn't large, merely a few drops, but the blood had already begun to spread, dark and unmistakable. Poirot knelt down, his fingers hovering just above the stain. "Fresh," he murmured, his voice cold and steady. This was no accident. Madame Fournier, standing behind him, wrung her hands nervously. "But where is the body?" she whispered, her voice tremulous with fear. Poirot didn't answer her immediately. His gaze had already shifted, sweeping across the room with razor-sharp precision. There was something else. Just a few feet from the stain lay a small white handkerchief, delicate, embroidered with the monogram. But Poirot picked it up gently, studying the stitching. It was faintly scented with expensive cologne, a subtle but distinct fragrance. But as he turned it over, his eyes caught a dark smudge near the edge. Ink, or perhaps soot. He frowned, his mind racing. "Curious," he muttered, his gaze now sweeping across the rest of the room. The bed, untouched. The wardrobe, standing closed. The writing desk, no signs of forced entry. Everything in the room was pristine, except for the unmistakable presence of blood. Poirot straightened, his brow furrowing as he turned toward Madame Fournier. "Are you certain this room was locked when you arrived?" She nodded quickly, her eyes wide. "I swear it. The key's been in my possession since Monsieur Rabineau left." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "The door was locked from the inside," he said slowly, tapping his fingers against his chin. The implications were clear. No other exit, no open windows, no signs of anyone entering or leaving by force. Yet someone had bled here tonight. Poirot moved toward the window, parting the heavy curtains with a deliberate motion. The moonlight spilled in, casting a cold glow across the scene beyond. The sheer drop of 40 feet to jagged rocks, and the relentless crashing of waves below. He tested the window latch. It was secure. He looked down at the treacherous ground below and frowned. If anyone had attempted to flee that way, they wouldn't have survived the fall. Behind him, Colonel Winfield's voice interrupted his thoughts, tinged with unease. "A locked room, fresh blood, and no body. What do you make of it, Poirot?" Poirot's gaze flickered back to the Colonel, his expression unreadable. "I make of it, Colonel, that we are at the beginning of a very strange affair." He turned, his eyes scanning the room again, each detail falling into place like pieces of a puzzle. He approached the desk, opening the top drawer carefully. Inside, a stack of hotel stationery sat neatly folded, untouched. Poirot lifted a sheet, inspecting it for any marks or signs of tampering. Nothing. He placed it back, and turned to the inkpot. A dark, almost untouched pool of ink sitting unused for what seemed like weeks. Poirot's eyes moved next to the wardrobe, swiftly opening it to reveal an empty interior. But it was the bed that held his attention once more. Everything about it was perfect. The sheets were neatly tucked, the pillows arranged with precision, the blankets untouched. Yet there was something deeply wrong. Poirot's fingers lightly traced the edges of the bed, his mind racing. There was no struggle here, no disturbance, nothing to indicate that anyone had been here at all, except for the unmistakable stain of blood on the carpet. The room, despite its calm appearance, was hiding something. Poirot felt it, the quiet weight of a secret buried just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. The pieces were there. He just had to put them together, and when he did, the truth would be far more terrifying than anyone could imagine. Poirot's fingers lingered on the edge of the mattress, his breath steady as he slowly lifted the top sheet, his sharp eyes scanning every inch of the bed beneath. His mustache twitched ever so slightly, his attention sharpening as he examined the faint indentation in the mattress, an indentation that could only have been left by someone who had lain there very recently, far more recently than anyone could have expected. Poirot pressed his palm against the spot, his brow furrowing slightly, as he felt the warmth still lingering. "Still warm," he murmured, his voice carrying the weight of a revelation that hit harder than any blow. A ripple of disbelief swept through the gathered guests, and Madame Fournier's hand flew to her chest, her eyes wide with a mix of horror and confusion. "Impossible," she whispered, as though uttering the word could somehow erase the truth. The room was empty. Poirot, however, remained unfazed. He straightened, brushing invisible dust from his sleeve with an air of calculated calmness. "No, madame," he replied, his tone cool yet unwavering. The room was locked, but it was not empty. His eyes scanned the faces of the guests, the weight of his words settling on them like a thick fog. "Someone has been in this room tonight, and someone has bled upon this carpet." His voice lowered, each word hanging in the air, thick with suspense. "The question, madame, is who? And more importantly," he paused, letting the silence stretch for a heartbeat before delivering the chilling line, "where have they gone?" A heavy silence followed, the tension so palpable it almost seemed to crackle in the air. The guests exchanged uneasy glances, suspicion flickering in their eyes. Poirot, however, was not shaken. He wasn't even disturbed. No, he was intrigued. This was not the kind of crime that frightened him. It was the kind that beckoned him, that called to his instincts like a puzzle begging to be solved. And Poirot knew one thing with absolute certainty. The truth always left its mark, and he, Poirot, would find it. As the silence in room 7 pressed down like a suffocating weight, the distant chime of the town clock rang out through the halls, the slow, deliberate tolls echoing with an eerie finality. 3 chimes. 3 slow, deliberate chimes that seemed to hang in the air, punctuating the stillness of the moment. Poirot stood near the bed, his fingers resting lightly on the warm indentation in the mattress, his mind already churning with questions. Where had the person gone? Had they left willingly, or had they been taken? And if so, by whom? The answers eluded him, but the sense of impending discovery hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. The sharp knock at the door downstairs broke his train of thought, the sudden intrusion a reminder of the world outside the mystery. The police had arrived. Madame Fournier, still pale and visibly shaken, hurried to admit them, and Poirot followed, his steps measured, his mind still locked on the enigma before him. The guests, now reluctant to return to their rooms, lingered in the hallway, whispering nervously among themselves. At the entrance stood Commissaire Lucien Moreau, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a thick mustache and sharp, calculating eyes. His dark uniform seemed to absorb the dim light, making him appear even more imposing. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, extending a hand, his voice cordial, though tinged with the formality of their first meeting. "A pleasure, though I wish it were under better circumstances. Poirot inclined his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Indeed, commissaire, he replied coolly. I fear we have quite a perplexing case on our hands. Moreau gestured to his two subordinates, who were already moving with a quiet efficiency, their notepads out, and ready for the task ahead. Tell me everything, Moreau said, turning his attention back to Madame Fournier, who launched into a hurried account of the evening's events. The footsteps heard outside the room, the locked door, the discovery of the bloodstain, and Poirot's observations. Moreau listened intently, occasionally nodding, his pen moving swiftly across the notepad. You say the room was locked from the inside? He asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. Yes, Madame Fournier confirmed, her voice trembling, and it had been unoccupied since Monsieur Rabineau's departure a week ago. Moreau's brow furrowed as he processed the information. Then how did anyone get in or out? He asked, his voice thick with suspicion. Poirot's lips curled into a faint smile, a quiet but confident acknowledgement of the riddle that had taken shape. That, monsieur, is the mystery. Moreau nodded to his officers, who began to search the room with methodical precision, inspecting the window, the wardrobe, and the bed. One of the policemen knelt beside the bloodstain, his face grim as he carefully examined it. Commissaire, he called. Whoever bled here did so within the last hour. The statement hung in the air like a thunderclap, confirming what Poirot had already suspected. The mystery was deeper, darker, and more intricate than they had first realized. The guests of the Hotel Bonne sat in tense silence, the air thick with apprehension, as the walls seemed to close in with each passing second. Poirot, his sharp mind working through the puzzle, leaned slightly forward in his high-backed chair, his fingers steepled in front of his lips as his gaze swept over each guest. His presence was commanding, yet oddly calming, as though he had already solved the mystery in his mind. Commis Marot stood by the door, arms crossed, observing with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. The room was alive with quiet murmurs, the flickering shadows of the fire casting a ghostly ambience across the room, but it was the bloodstains in room 7, still fresh in their memory, that clung to the air more powerfully than the scent of aged wood or cigar smoke. It's curious, isn't it? Poirot began smoothly, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. A locked room, a pool of blood, and yet no body to account for. Someone here knows more than they're letting on. His words landed like a stone tossed into a still pond, creating ripples of unease. Madame Fournier, still pale, shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes darting nervously from guest to guest. Marot cleared his throat, stepping forward, his voice authoritative but tinged with frustration. We will speak with each of you individually, he announced, and you will tell us where you were when the disturbance occurred, and if you heard or saw anything unusual. Poirot nodded, turning his piercing eyes to the first guest, a retired British officer, Colonel Winfield, whose stiff posture and cold blue eyes suggested a man of few words. The colonel's hands rested rigidly on his knees, his jaw set as though every breath was measured. Colonel Poirot began, his voice low and deliberate. Where were you this evening? The colonel's voice was clipped, measured. In my room, he replied. I was reading, preparing to turn in for the night when I heard the commotion in the hallway. Poirot's brow furrowed slightly. And the sound from room 7? Nothing, the colonel said, his voice betraying no hint of uncertainty. I only became aware of the disturbance when Madame Fournier cried out. Poirot nodded slowly, tapping his fingers against his knee. And what of Felix Rabineau? Had you met him? The colonel's expression remained neutral, but his lips pressed tighter. The name means nothing to me. Poirot studied him for a moment, his gaze sharp, then leaned back. Very well, Colonel, he said, his voice smooth but carrying an undercurrent of scrutiny. As Poirot turned his attention to the next guest, a young woman named Violet Tyndall, her posture was slightly more relaxed, though her green eyes were alight with curiosity, perhaps even excitement. She leaned forward, almost eagerly. I must say, this is all terribly exciting, she remarked, her voice tinged with amusement, though Poirot's keen eyes caught the flicker of something deeper, fear perhaps or something more. Marot's frown deepened as Madame Soisel Tyndall spoke, her voice a little too light, a little too eager to brush off the tension hanging in the air. Madame Swell, this is a serious matter, he said, his tone heavy with the weight of the situation. Oh, of course, she replied, too quickly, her green eyes flickering with barely contained excitement. It's like something out of a novel, isn't it? Poirot, unfazed, gave a small knowing smile as he leaned forward, his gaze sharp. And you, Madame Swell, where were you this evening? In my room, she answered, brushing a strand of her dark hair behind her ear. I was writing, you see. Crime stories, fictional ones of course, she added with a nervous chuckle. I was taking notes for my next book when I heard the footsteps, and then all the noise in the hallway. That's when I came out to see what was happening. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly, his voice measured. You heard footsteps? Yes, she nodded, her voice growing more animated. Heavy ones, slow at first then quicker. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Interesting, he murmured. You didn't look out of your room at the time? No, I was too focused on my work, she replied. Poirot tilted his head, his eyes scanning her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. And Felix Rabino, she hesitated for a moment, pursing her lips. I remember the name from the register, but I never met him. Poirot nodded slowly, processing her words, before turning to the next guest, Dr. Julia Mercier. The French doctor sat with his arms folded, his face a mask of indifference. When it was his turn to speak, his voice was clipped and precise. I was in my room, reading medical journals. Poirot's sharp eyes didn't miss the slight twitch in the doctor's jaw. You didn't hear the footsteps? He asked. Dr. Mercier paused for a moment, then answered, his voice steady but tinged with a hint of uncertainty. Perhaps, but this is an old building, Madame Swell. One hears many things. Poirot regarded him thoughtfully. You are a doctor, yes, he continued, his tone casual, though his eyes bore into the man. Tell me, how much blood would one lose from a wound before it became life-threatening? Dr. Mercier blinked, caught off guard by the question. It depends on the nature of the wound, the location, he replied, his voice almost clinical. A minor cut may bleed quite a bit, but not be fatal. A deeper wound. Well, that's another matter. Poirot nodded, his gaze unwavering. Could a man sustain an injury, lose some blood, and still walk away? The doctor hesitated before answering, his voice calm. Yes, certainly, if the wound was not severe. Poirot smiled slightly. Very good, doctor. He turned to the next guest, Madame Estelle Lachlan, the elegantly dressed widow, who regarded him with palpable impatience. I was asleep, Madame Swell Poirot, as any reasonable person would be, she said, her tone dismissive. I heard a disturbance, but I had no interest in getting involved. Poirot studied her for a moment, his eyes narrowing. You heard the footsteps? He asked. Yes, she sniffed, her tone dismissive. But I assumed it was a guest returning late. Poirot's gaze remained steady. You seem quite certain that this affair does not concern you, madam. It does not, she replied firmly. Then you won't mind answering one more question. Poirot's voice was calm, but the tension in the room thickened. Did you know Felix Rabino? A flicker of something passed over her face, too brief, too subtle, but it was there, and Poirot caught it. She shook her head, her voice steady. No, I did not. Poirot's mustache twitched, but he said nothing, turning to the next couple, Mr. and Mrs. Redfern. The stout Mr. Redfern gripped his wife's hand tightly, his face a mask of unease. It's dreadful. Absolutely dreadful, Mrs. Redfern whispered, her voice trembling. Poirot turned to her, his voice gentle but insistent. And you, madam? Did you hear anything unusual? Mrs. Redfern nodded, her face pale. Yes, she said, her voice trembling. I heard something. A thud, and then silence. A thud. Poirot's voice sharpened with curiosity. Could you describe it? It was heavy, she said slowly, her brow furrowed. Like something falling but not quite. Poirot's eyes narrowed, a spark of interest lighting his features. Where were you when you heard this? I was awake, she said, glancing at her husband. Mr. Redfern was asleep, but I was awake. And Felix Rubino. Poirot pressed his voice low and steady. Did you ever speak to him? Mrs. Redfern shook her head. No. Poirot turned to her husband. Mr. Redfern, who was rubbing his chin thoughtfully. And you, Mr. Redfern? Did you hear anything? The stout man shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Didn't hear a thing, he muttered, shrugging. Slept right through it. Poirot nodded slowly, his mind working furiously. As the questioning came to a close, Poirot leaned back, deep in thought. He had observed each of them closely. Their words, their body language, the subtle tells that spoke volumes. But one thing was certain. The truth was far more elusive than he had first anticipated. And the mystery surrounding Felix Rubino's disappearance was only just beginning to unravel. Poirot sat back in his chair, his fingers interlaced as his sharp eyes swept over the room. His mind churned with the information he'd gathered. The expressions, the subtle shifts in tone, and the movements of the guests had spoken volumes. Though none had directly admitted anything. The room had been filled with carefully crafted stories. But Poirot had seen enough. Some were hiding something. But the question remained. What exactly were they hiding? Marot, standing near the crackling fireplace, finally spoke, his voice cutting through the silence. So Poirot, what's your impression? Who among them is hiding something? Poirot's lips curled into a faint smile, his mustache twitching as he answered. Mon ami, everyone is hiding something. But the real question is, what are they hiding? Marot exhaled in frustration, rubbing his temples as he asked. Let's go over the facts then. A man, Felix Rubino, was in room 7 tonight. He was injured, bled, and then vanished. Yet the door was locked from the inside, and the window was shut. How does that make sense? Poirot's expression remained impassive as he murmured. It makes sense, mon ami. Just not yet. The pattern is not clear. Marot groaned, frustrated. What do you make of their statements? Poirot leaned forward, tapping his fingers thoughtfully. Let's analyze them carefully. Colonel Winfield claimed he was reading in his room, and only came out when he heard Madame Fournier scream. A disciplined man, precise in his answers, but when asked about the footsteps, he hesitated. Why? Did he hear something more than he admitted? Poirot paused and continued. Miss Violet Tyndall said she was writing in her room, and heard heavy footsteps, but did not look out. Odd. She was overly enthusiastic about the situation, almost as if she found it exciting. She did not react with fear, only curiosity. Her description of the footsteps, slow at first then quickened, was too detailed for someone who supposedly didn't see anything. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he moved to the next. Dr. Julian Mercier claimed he was reading journals, and didn't notice the sounds in the hallway. A bit too evasive, don't you think? He was hiding something. Was it disinterest? Or was he protecting someone? Poirot continued his analysis without pause, his mind racing through the puzzle. Madame Estelle Vaughan claimed she was asleep and heard a noise, but thought nothing of it. When asked about Felix Rubino, she paused. A brief, almost imperceptible moment. She knew him, or at least knew of him. Poirot's eyes flickered to Marot's, and then he moved on. And then the Redferns. George and Ment. Ment heard a thud, followed by silence. George slept through it all. The thud, important. If Rubino was conscious and injured, he wouldn't simply collapse. Something happened in that room. But what? Poirot leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. The locked room. That's where the key lies. The disappearance of Felix Rubino is one puzzle. But how the door was locked afterward? Now that's the mystery. Who could have locked the door from the inside? Marot frowned, his mind struggling to grasp the implications. Surely not Rubino himself. Poirot nodded slowly, his eyes gleaming with quiet certainty. Perhaps, But if he did, where is the key now? Where did it go? The room fell silent, as both men turned over the possibilities in their minds. The weight of the mystery, pressing heavily upon them. Each piece, each word, each subtle detail held a clue, and Poirot was only just beginning to connect the dots. Poirot's sharp eyes remained fixed on the faint footprints below the window, his mind churning through the possibilities, each more convoluted than the last. Poirot stood beside him, his brow furrowed in thought, yet Poirot's unwavering focus on the prints only intensified the growing tension. The question echoed in both of their minds. Had Felix Rabino somehow managed to slip away from this locked room, or had something far more sinister occurred? Poirot's lips tightened as he glanced toward Poirot, his voice low, yet laden with curiosity. "Mon ami," he murmured. "This is the riddle, is it not? If Rabino is still alive, we must find him. But if he is dead, then the puzzle deepens. Where, pray tell, is the body?" The unsettling realization swept over Poirot as he considered the implications, but Poirot's expression shifted, as if a new thought had dawned on him. Without another word, Poirot stood abruptly, his movements swift and purposeful. "Come, Poirot," he commanded, his voice steady and resolute. "I wish to see room 7 once more." Poirot hesitated, his suspicion rising. "Now, but surely there's nothing more to be gleaned from that room," he argued. But Poirot was already heading for the door. His mind had clicked into place, and the hunt was on. Together, they ascended the dimly lit staircase, the silence of the hotel pressing in around them like a heavy fog. The flickering shadows of their lanterns stretched long and distorted along the walls, adding an eerie quality to the already unsettling atmosphere. It was as if the hotel itself was holding its breath, anticipating the unraveling of a mystery that had already begun to gnaw at the edges of their understanding. When they reached room 7, Poirot's eyes swept the room once more with a critical gaze. It was as though something was still hidden, something not yet uncovered, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the key to the mystery lay just beneath the surface. Moving toward the window, Poirot unlatched it with a soft click, pushing it open to allow the cold night air to rush inside, carrying the scent of damp earth and forgotten secrets. The faint rustling of leaves outside added a layer of unease to the already tense scene. Poirot leaned out of the window, peering into the darkness below, searching for the slightest sign of something amiss. Poirot stepped up beside him, his eyes following Poirot's line of sight, his heartbeat quickening as the silence deepened. "What are you thinking, Poirot?" Poirot asked, his voice a mixture of concern and curiosity. Poirot didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gestured toward the ground below, his finger pointing toward the faint shadows. "Look, Poirot," he said quietly. "Tell me what you see." Poirot squinted, his heart pounding in his chest, the night air growing colder as the tension mounted. His breath caught as his eyes landed on the barely visible footprints in the soft earth below. "Footprints," he whispered, the realization dawning on him with a chill. There they were, 2 distinct sets of impressions left behind by a pair of shoes, leading away from the window, barely noticeable in the moonlight. But they were there, undeniable. Someone had indeed left this room, only not through the door. Poirot stepped back from the window, his face unreadable, his mind working furiously as he pieced together the fragments of the mystery. "And now, my friend," Poirot said, his voice cool and assured, "the real hunt begins." The moon hung low in the sky, casting its pale light over the hotel and the surrounding grounds. The night was eerily quiet, save for the soft rustling of the leaves in the garden. Poirot and Poirot moved away from the window, their attention now fully consumed by the footprints. The weight of their discovery settled in, and Poirot wasted no time. "So you intend to follow this trail, do you?" Poirot asked, a note of both intrigue and caution in his voice. Poirot's response was immediate, his tone unwavering. "Of course, mon ami. Once a trail is found, it must be followed before it vanishes into the night." Without another word, Poirot turned and strode toward the door, Poirot following at his heels. The atmosphere outside was thick with the cold, the night air sharp against their skin. The hotel stood silent behind them, as though watching their every move. As they descended the grand staircase, their footsteps echoed in the quiet of the hotel, a reminder of how far they had come, and how much further they had yet to go. The concierge, Miss Bashar, looked up from her desk as they passed, her eyes flickering with concern. "Miss Poirot, it is late. Should I not accompany you?" she asked. But Poirot simply flashed her a reassuring smile. "No, Miss Bashar," he replied smoothly. "The good commissaire and I shall manage quite well on our own." They stepped out into the cool night air, the garden surrounding the hotel now stretching out before them. The faint rustling of the leaves was the only sound, their movement like a whispered secret in the stillness of the night. Poirot pulled his coat tighter around himself as they made their way toward the side path that veered around the hotel. "Where exactly do you intend to start?" he asked, though Poirot had already pointed toward the spot beneath the window. The faint footprints were now clearer under the lantern light, the impressions sharp against the gravel path. Two distinct sets of footprints led away from the building, and Poirot crouched down to inspect them closely. "Observe, Poirot," he said quietly. "One set of prints, a man's shoe standard size. But look closely." Poirot leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he examined the marks. Each detail seemed to offer more questions than answers, and yet Poirot's calm demeanor suggested he was already several steps ahead in the unraveling of the mystery. The hunt had taken a new turn, and there was no turning back now. Poirot's keen gaze lingered on the uneven prints beneath the window, his mind unraveling the mystery of their origin. His brow furrowed slightly as he studied the marks, too deep in places, shallow in others, a stark contrast to the natural consistent shape one might expect. "Inconsistent," he muttered, his mustache twitching in quiet approval. "The depth, it suggests someone in distress. Whoever made these was unsteady on their feet." Poirot stepped closer, his voice barely a whisper. "Felix Rubino," he suggested, though there was a note of uncertainty in his words. Poirot straightened, his sharp eyes now locked onto the path ahead. "Perhaps," he said softly, but there was a flicker of doubt in his voice. "Let's see where these lead us." With that, Poirot started forward, his every step measured and deliberate, as though each motion was calculated for the mystery that was unfolding before them. The trail led them away from the window, and into the moonlit garden, where the cool breeze rustled the overgrown foliage. They followed the prints as they veered off the gravel path, and onto the dew-covered grass, passing a small rose arbor. The flowers wilted under the early spring chill, their petals brittle and crumbling in the breeze. Poirot couldn't help but sigh, his breath fogging in the air as he considered the direction. This path leads toward the back of the hotel. If someone wanted to disappear, this would be the perfect route. Poirot glanced at him, a small smile playing at the edges of his lips. "Ah, but disappearing is never as simple as it seems, mon ami," he replied, his tone almost amused. "The world, Poirot, leaves its marks, if you know where to look." And so they continued, Poirot leading the way with an unspoken confidence, until they came upon a small stone bench tucked beneath the drooping branches of an ancient willow tree. Poirot paused abruptly, his eyes narrowing as he spotted something dark upon the pale stone. "Regardez," he muttered, pointing toward the bench. "What do you make of this?" Poirot approached cautiously, his lantern casting eerie shadows on the ground. His breath hitched when he saw the dark stain marring the surface of the bench. "Blood," he whispered, a chill running down his spine. Poirot's gloved hand hovered over the stain, his fingers gently brushing against the dried residue. "It's old, but not completely dried. Whoever left this stain sat here, likely gathering their strength before moving on." Poirot's eyes scanned the area around them, his expression growing more intense. The footprints had stopped at the bench, but now there were other marks, grooves in the dirt, dragged and indistinct. "Dragged," Poirot said, his voice rising in disbelief. So they were too weak to walk. Or unconscious. Poirot's eyes darkened with concern, as he considered the possibility. Yes, he murmured, his voice almost to himself. Someone left room 7. Perhaps Felix Rubino. Injured, bleeding. They made it this far before collapsing. His gaze flicked toward the disturbed ground, and then toward the faint trail, leading off toward a darkened greenhouse on the edge of the property. But who took them? And where? Poirot's sharp eyes traced the path leading toward the eerie structure. The greenhouse stood at the periphery of the grounds. Its glass panels cracked and shattered in places, casting jagged reflections in the pale moonlight. The air around it was thick with the scent of earth and neglect. Poirot felt a cold shiver run through him as they approached, his mind racing with questions that he could not yet answer. The greenhouse, he muttered under his breath. Why would anyone go there? Poirot said nothing, but moved toward the building with purpose, his steps light and careful on the damp earth. As they reached the door, it groaned in protest as Poirot pushed it open, the sound echoing in the stillness of the night. Inside, the moonlight filtered through the cracked glass, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. Rows of forgotten plants clung to the walls, their leaves overgrown and tangled, suffocating beneath the weight of neglect. The air was thick with decay and dampness. Poirot's steps faltered for a moment, as his eyes darted to the center of the greenhouse. Half hidden in the shadows was a discarded object, a blood-stained handkerchief lying on the floor, its fabric crumpled and stained dark red. Poirot crouched down and picked it up, examining it with careful fingers. This, he said softly, was left here. Poirot stepped closer, his breath catching in his throat. It's still damp, he whispered, a strange sense of dread creeping into his chest. Poirot turned the handkerchief over, revealing the faint monogrammed initials stitched into the fabric. He exhaled slowly, a grim realization settling in. Felix Rubino, Poirot murmured. Poirot straightened, his sharp gaze meeting Poirot's. He was here, and now he is not. The weight of the discovery hung heavy in the air, as Poirot's mind turned over the implications of what they had found. He clenched the handkerchief tightly in his hand, his thoughts racing. Someone took him, he said quietly, his voice thick with determination. And we must find out who before it's too late. The air inside the greenhouse was thick with the scent of damp soil and decaying plant life. But it wasn't just the earthiness that clung to the walls. A sharp metallic odor, faint but unmistakable, hovered in the air. Poe's sharp gaze swept across the room, his mind racing with thoughts too dangerous to voice. Poirot was right. Felix Rubino had been here, no question. But the question that gnawed at Poe was not just where he had gone. It was who had taken him, and why. Poe's fingers lightly brushed a blood-stained handkerchief, found deep within the shadows of the greenhouse. The monogram FR stared back at him with eerie clarity. His breath caught as he exhaled softly. He was here. Poirot moved closer, his lantern casting dancing shadows across the floor. But Rubino's presence was already beginning to fade. Poe remained fixated on the spot where the fabric had been dropped. It was clear now. The man hadn't left willingly. Whoever took him was careful, Poe murmured, almost to himself, eyes scanning the room. Poirot's hand gripped the lantern tighter. The blood is fresh. He couldn't have gone far. Poe's sharp eyes turned to the bloodstain that marred the stone floor. There were no signs of a struggle. Only a subtle trail, leading toward the far corner of the room. He motioned for Poirot to follow, his steps quiet and deliberate. At the far end of the greenhouse, behind an old wooden cupboard, a disturbed patch of soil caught Poe's attention. His instincts flared. Someone had been trying to conceal their presence. Poe's hand slid along the dusty cupboard's edge, revealing a coat, Rubino's coat. The fabric was wet, and a dark stain marred the sleeve. Poirot's lantern light flickered across the coat, revealing the gold-stitched initials. Rubino, Poirot whispered under his breath, his words like a silent prayer to some higher power. But Poe was already moving. The coat hadn't been discarded casually. It had been hidden, and the blood trail that led to it had been wiped clean in places. Someone had been trying to erase their tracks. But why leave behind such an obvious clue? Pooh's gaze turned to the open cupboard door, his eyes narrowing. Whoever did this was in a hurry, he said quietly. His words hung in the air like smoke, a cryptic riddle they were only beginning to solve. But just as the weight of the mystery seemed to deepen, the air outside the greenhouse shifted. A faint rustling, barely perceptible, caught their attention. Morrow instinctively reached for his revolver, but Pooh placed a hand on his arm, the calmness in his touch a stark contrast to the tension in the air. "Patience, mon ami," Pooh whispered, stepping toward a narrow window, his eyes narrowing as they focused on the figure just beyond the glass. A dark silhouette moved swiftly through the moonlit garden, cloaked in shadows, too cautious to be seen. Every step was calculated, every movement deliberate. Someone was watching, but who? The answer was slipping further out of reach, yet Pooh knew one thing for certain: their pursuit was far from over. The sound of muffled footsteps echoed through the quiet night, the figure moving stealthily, barely a shadow in the dark. As they approached the hedges, the faintest glint of moonlight revealed the fleeting image of a face, a mere flash in the lantern's glow. Pooh inhaled sharply, the breath caught in his throat as Morrow whispered, his voice laced with certainty. "It's him, Pooh, Dr. Julian Mercier." Without another word, Morrow sprang into action, throwing open the greenhouse door, and dashing into the night, his revolver gripped tightly in his hand. He shouted, his voice cutting through the stillness. The figure froze for a moment, then bolted, breaking into a swift run. Morrow was faster, his legs propelling him forward with predatory grace, the figure's silhouette a blur in his sights. Pooh, ever the strategist, called after him, urging him on, and they both pursued through the overgrown garden, their steps muffled by the damp grass. The chase led them through the shadows, winding between tall hedges and ancient trees. But Mercier was no match for Morrow's relentless speed. Just as the doctor neared the side gate, Morrow lunged, grabbing him by the arm, and twisting it violently, pulling him to a stop. Mercier cried out, struggling to break free, but Morrow held firm, his grip like iron. "Let me go," the doctor gasped, but Morrow merely growled, "Not a chance." He wrenched the doctor's arm behind his back and shoved him harshly against the gate, the metal cold against his skin. "What are you running from, Mercier?" Morrow's voice was low, dangerous. Pooh arrived, his calm demeanor, a stark contrast to the tension of the scene, adjusting his cuffs as he studied the doctor. "A most interesting reaction, mon ami," Pooh remarked, his voice sharp with intrigue. "One might almost think you had something to hide." Mercier's face was a ghostly pale, his eyes darting nervously between them. "You don't understand," he stammered, but Pooh's eyes gleamed with quiet menace. "Oh, we understand very well, doctor. You were sneaking around the hotel, and when you saw us, you ran. The question, however, is why?" Mercier swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. "I wasn't sneaking. I was just," he faltered, searching for the right words. Morrow's gaze hardened. "Go on. You were only what?" The doctor hesitated, licking his lips. "I was looking for someone." His voice trailed off as though the words themselves could betray him. Pooh raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "For whom?" he asked, his tone smooth but demanding. Mercier swallowed again, the tension in the air thickening. "Felix Rabino," he muttered under his breath, as if confessing a sin. Morrow's grip tightened, his knuckles whitening. "So you do know him," he said, his voice like ice. The doctor exhaled sharply, his breath shaky. "Yes," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "But I swear to you I don't know where he is now." Pooh studied him with unwavering intensity. "Ah, but you do know where he was," he said, his tone barely a murmur. The doctor closed his eyes, his face etched with regret and fear. After a long pause he nodded. "Yes," he said, his voice barely audible. "I know where he was, and I know why he disappeared." Morrow and Pooh exchanged a glance, the pieces of the puzzle slowly falling into place. Pooh straightened his tie, his gaze never leaving the doctor's face. "Then by all means, doctor," Pooh said, his voice as smooth as silk. "Perhaps it's time for you to tell us everything." The doctor stiffened, the cold wind rustling the trees around them, his breath still quick from the chase. He stood pinned against the garden gate, his future uncertain. Pooh adjusted his cuffs with calm precision, while Maro's grip remained firm, unyielding. "You were looking for Felix Rubino," Maro repeated, his voice laced with menace. "Now you will tell us exactly why." The doctor hesitated again, his eyes flickering toward the hotel, as if searching for a way out. "I cannot speak here," he whispered, his voice trembling with fear. "If someone sees me." Pugh's mustache twitched, and he leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "Ah, so you fear being seen as much as you feared being caught. That tells us much, Doctor." He turned to Maro with a nod. "Very well," he said, his voice still smooth, but now laced with a dangerous edge. "We shall not conduct this interrogation under the stars." With a swift motion, Pugh led the way back toward the hotel, Maro walking stiffly between them, the doctor a reluctant prisoner in their midst. They entered through a side door, avoiding the main lobby, and made their way to Maro's private office, the heavy door closing behind them with a resounding thud. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with anticipation. The truth was just within reach, and both men were ready to extract it, no matter the cost. The room was dim, the only light coming from a single flickering candle on a corner table, casting eerie shadows across the walls. Julian Mercier sat across from Maro and Poirot, his posture tense, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, as if holding on to some fragile secret. Poirot's gaze never wavered from him, sharp as a hawk's, while Maro stood, arms crossed, exuding an aura of impatient menace. "No more evasion, Doctor," Poirot said, his voice smooth yet laced with authority. "You were sneaking through the hotel in the dead of night, searching for a missing man whose bloodied handkerchief we found in the greenhouse. You knew Felix Rubino was here. You feared being seen. Now tell us why." Dr. Mercier's breath caught in his throat, his eyes darting between them, his resolve faltering. With a resigned sigh, he muttered, "Felix Rubino was my patient." Poirot leaned forward, a glint of understanding passing through his sharp gaze. "Your patient?" Maro echoed, his voice low, almost predatory. Mercier nodded reluctantly, rubbing his forehead as if the truth weighed heavily upon him. "He came to me months ago in Paris, suffering from extreme paranoia, convinced he was being watched, followed. At first I thought it was merely stress, delusions. But then strange things started happening. Anonymous messages, break-ins with nothing stolen. Felix, he became obsessed, convinced that someone, or something was after him." Poirot's gaze hardened. "And what did you do, Doctor? Did you believe him?" Mercier's eyes clouded, his face drawn with uncertainty. "At first, no. I thought it was all in his head. But then," he paused, looking down, clearly struggling to continue. "Then he disappeared, vanished without a trace. I thought he'd fled, left everything behind." Poirot studied him carefully, a new suspicion creeping into his voice. "But then tonight, you saw his name on the guest list here at the hotel. What are you not telling us, Doctor?" Mercier swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "I came here tonight because I was hoping to find him, to help him. I wasn't sure if he was in danger, or if he had gone mad." Maro's eyes narrowed. "2 nights ago you saw him, and he was frightened out of his mind." Mercier's face paled, his voice breaking. "Yes. He told me he had made a terrible mistake, that something was happening here, at the hotel, something that could destroy him, if he didn't leave immediately." Poirot leaned in even closer, his voice sharp. "Did he tell you what it was? What he had uncovered?" Mercier closed his eyes, shaking his head. "No. He only said there were eyes everywhere, that he had trusted the wrong people." And then, his voice faltered. Then he was gone. There was a heavy silence. Poirot's eyes narrowed. And now you fear he's dead? Dr. Mercier nodded gravely, a cloud of dread hanging over him. Yes, I do. But Poirot's smile was unsettlingly calm. No, doctor. Felix Rubino is not dead. Marot and Mercier exchanged a startled glance. What makes you so certain? Marot demanded. Poirot's smile grew colder, his voice low and steady. If he were dead, there would be no need to hide him. Someone has gone to great lengths to erase his presence, but not his life. And that, my friends, tells me that Felix Rubino is still alive. Marot rubbed his chin thoughtfully, his mind racing. Then the question is, who took him? And why? Poirot's expression darkened. That, mon ami, is what we are about to uncover. The weight of their words hung heavily in the air, the atmosphere thick with tension. Poirot's eyes flicked to the door, his mind already spinning with the possibilities. We have a paranoid man on the run, a trail of blood, a mysterious disappearance, and a doctor who claims to have the answers. But the truth, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, is more twisted than any of us can imagine. Poirot adjusted his cuffs with a careful, deliberate motion, his eyes glinting with an unsettling calm. Ah, but we have more than that, mon ami, he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a razor. We have our first real lead. Dr. Mercier blinked, clearly taken aback. We do. Poirot's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. Yes, Rubino was afraid of someone here at the hotel. And now, mes amis, it is time for Hercule Poirot to flush them out. The words lingered in the air, like a slow burning fuse, and Marot straightened, his curiosity piqued. The investigation had been spiraling into increasingly dangerous territories, and Poirot's assurance that a breakthrough had come sent a chill down his spine. As the trio made their way to the hotel office, the stillness of the building seemed to reflect the gravity of their pursuit. A solitary desk lamp cast long, twisted shadows across the room, illuminating stacks of ledgers and reservation books that seemed almost too neat, too organized for something so sinister. Poirot removed his gloves with deliberate precision, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the scene. Now, mon ami, he murmured, his voice low and tinged with anticipation. We shall see which names are hiding secrets. Marot flicked open the guest registry with an air of resolve, scanning the rows of names. This is the complete list of everyone staying at the hotel, he said, running a finger down the page. I've already examined it once, but if Rubino was afraid of someone here, we must take a closer look. Poirot nodded, his gaze fixed on the page, as if unlocking hidden truths within its ink. Fear, mon ami, is a most revealing emotion, and if Felix Rubino feared a name on this list, then we must ask ourselves, who among these guests was he running from? A silence settled between them, as Marot began reading the names aloud, his voice tinged with skepticism. Albert Gerard, a wealthy industrialist from Lyon. Madame Claire Vallet, a Parisian socialite. M. and Madame Fontaine, a retired couple on holiday. Dr. Julien Mercier, the nervous doctor sitting before us. Madame Elise Chabrol, a widow staying alone. Miss Laurent Dufresne, a journalist with a keen interest in political affairs. Miss Margaret Ashworth, an Englishwoman, a frequent traveler to France. And of course Felix Rubino, the missing man. Poirot's fingertips lightly tapped the desk, his eyes narrowing as he absorbed each name. And there we have it. The guests of Hotel Bonn, at the time of Rubino's disappearance. Marot sighed, frustration flickering across his face. Nothing unusual stands out. These people have no apparent connection to one another. Poirot raised a finger, his expression cold with resolve. Ah, but one of them must have had a connection to Rubino. The question is, which one? He leaned back, eyes scanning the list once more, his mind spinning webs of possibilities. The names that speak, Poirot muttered to himself before turning to Mercier. Tell me, doctor, do any of these names seem familiar to you? Mercier hesitated, his brow furrowing as if searching for an elusive answer. I don't know any of them personally except Rabineau, of course. But, Poirot leaned forward, his gaze intensifying. But, Mercier licked his lips nervously. Mademoiselle Laurent Dufresne, the journalist. I recognize her name. She's written for Léon Périzier, a publication that often covers financial scandals. Poirot's eyes sharpened like a predator on the hunt. A journalist specializing in financial scandals, you say? And what would that have to do with Rabineau? Marot frowned, his mind churning. Do you think Rabineau was involved in something illegal? Poirot did not immediately respond. Instead he turned to Marot, a question hanging in the air between them. And what about you, mon ami? Do any of these names strike a chord with you? Marot rubbed his chin thoughtfully, his gaze lingering on one name in particular. Madame Elise Chabrol. I've heard of her. A widow, yes? But there's something about her. I can't place it. Poirot's lips curled into a small knowing smile. Something indeed, he murmured. We shall see, mon ami, what secrets these names hold. For I suspect we are only beginning to peel back the layers of deception. The air in the room grew heavier, thick with the promise of impending revelations. Every name on that list was now a potential link in a chain of betrayal, fear, and hidden motives. The question was no longer if Rabineau had been running from something. It was who among these guests had been chasing him all along, and why. The pieces were falling into place, but the final image remained shrouded in shadow. The morning sun cast long golden beams across the grand dining hall of Hotel Bonn, filling the room with an ethereal glow that made everything shimmer in its light. The once muted chatter of the guests was now a soft hum, mingling with the clink of silverware, and the faint rustling of newspaper pages. At a table near the large window, Hercule Poirot sat in his usual impeccable grey suit, a violet handkerchief peeking from his breast pocket, his sharp eyes scanning the room with a quiet intensity that suggested he was always aware of everything happening around him. His fingers delicately stirred his coffee, his gaze moving from one guest to another, observing the subtle interactions, the unspoken secrets that the room seemed to whisper. The warmth of the room was at odds with the coolness in his eyes. He was a man who thrived in shadows, always seeking to uncover what others preferred to keep hidden. Across the room, at the farthest corner, sat Madame Elise Chabrol. The widow exuded an air of effortless elegance that made her seem almost untouchable, her posture straight and poised, her silver hair coiled neatly in an elegant bun. She was draped in black, an unexpected choice given the warmth of the season, but it only seemed to accentuate her mysterious aura. Her dark eyes, hidden behind thick tortoiseshell spectacles, observed the room with a detached calmness, as if she had long ago grown accustomed to being the subject of many eyes, yet never gave any of them the satisfaction of truly knowing her. The widow seemed impervious to the world around her, yet Poirot could sense the undercurrent of something much deeper beneath her serene exterior. A woman with a past that was not as distant as she might have liked. Poirot placed his coffee cup back down on its saucer with a soft clink, the sound almost deliberate in its precision. He turned to Inspector Marot, who sat opposite him, his expression unreadable, but his tension palpable. "It is time, mes amis," Poirot murmured in his deep, deliberate tone, his voice barely rising above the hum of the room. His eyes didn't stray from Madame Chabrol as he spoke. "We must learn what secrets Madame Chabrol carries." Marot gave a brief nod, his eyes narrowing as he followed Poirot's gaze. She lost her husband to scandal years ago, and if Rabineau was afraid of something, she might know why. The air between them thickened with a shared understanding. There was a thread that bound these two people: Rabineau, the disappeared man, and the widow, whose past was entwined in the very heart of scandal and mystery. Poirot's lips curled into a faint smile, almost a smirk. "Let us not keep the lady waiting." The two of them rose from their seats, their movements fluid and synchronized, as they made their way across the room toward Madame Chabrol. The other guests seemed oblivious to their approach, caught in their own conversations or distracted by their morning routines. But Poirot and Marot moved with purpose, their focus solely on the widow. When they reached her table, Madame Chabrol slowly lifted her gaze, meeting their eyes with a cool, measured look. There was no surprise in her expression, only the quiet knowledge of a woman who had been watched for so long that nothing, not even the most unexpected of visitors, could rattle her. "Miss Pooh, Inspector Marot," she greeted them, her voice smooth but with an edge of something unreadable. "I was wondering when you would come." Pooh inclined his head, a slight smile touching his lips, but there was no warmth in it. His gaze was penetrating, studying her every movement, her every gesture. "Madame, you flatter us. But tell me, how did you know we were seeking you out?" His voice was measured, but the undertone of curiosity was clear. Madame Chabrol took a slow sip of her coffee, the delicate cup held in her elegant hand, before setting it down with a soft click. "You are searching for Felix Rabineau, aren't you?" she asked, her voice laced with an almost imperceptible amusement. "And I imagine you believe his disappearance is somehow connected to me." There was no question in her tone, just a quiet certainty, as if she had already calculated their every move. Pugh's expression remained neutral, but inside, his mind was already racing. "Madame, I believe everything is connected. The question is, how?" he asked, his voice low and deliberate, as if weighing each word. She exhaled softly, her lips curling into the faintest of smiles. "I did not know Felix Rabineau well," she began, her eyes briefly flickering with something almost imperceptible. "But I knew of him." She paused, her gaze unwavering as she studied Pooh's reaction, as though measuring his every thought. "My late husband Philip Chabrol was a lawyer, a very powerful lawyer. He handled affairs that were delicate, shall we say." Marot, who had been quietly watching the exchange, leaned forward, his eyes sharp and focused. "Affairs of finance, perhaps?" he asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. Madame Chabrol nodded slightly, the faintest shift in her posture indicating that she was not unaware of the implications of Marot's question. "Indeed," she replied softly, the single word hanging in the air with an unspoken weight. There was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, as though a veil had been lifted, but not enough for them to see the full picture. Pooh's gaze hardened, and for a moment he let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of Madame Chabrol's words to settle between them. Felix Rabineau, a man who had disappeared in fear, was entangled in a world of scandal far deeper than anyone had anticipated. And the widow, it seemed, had more to do with that world than she was letting on. The pieces were falling into place, but they were still missing something crucial, a key that could unlock the truth. As Madame Chabrol sat there, composed and enigmatic, Pooh knew they were on the verge of something much larger than they had anticipated. The widow had a part to play in this puzzle, but whether she was the villain or the victim was still unclear. And somewhere in the shadows, the truth waited, just out of reach. Sipping her coffee, Madame Chabrol's fingers lightly traced the rim of the delicate cup, her gaze distant, as though lost in a memory too dangerous to recall. "Among my husband's former clients," she began, her voice thick with the weight of an untold story, "was a man named Felix Rabineau." Marot's eyes, sharp and calculating, narrowed at the mention of the name. "Are you suggesting Rabineau was involved in something illegal?" he asked, his voice edged with suspicion. Madame Chabrol didn't answer immediately. She placed her cup down with deliberate care, her hands folding neatly in front of her, as if organizing her thoughts before revealing more of her hidden truth. Her gaze lifted, meeting Pooh's, and she spoke with quiet intensity. "Let us just say that he was involved in something dangerous, and my husband knew about it." Pooh leaned forward, his voice low but unwavering. "What was Rabineau running from?" Madame Chabrol hesitated, her lips pressing together as if weighing how much she should reveal. The silence stretched between them before she spoke, her voice a whisper, barely audible yet heavy with foreboding. "Powerful men, men who do not forgive mistakes, and I believe Rabineau made a very costly mistake." The words hung in the air, charged with unspoken implications. Pooh's gaze sharpened, his mind racing to connect the dots. "The kind of mistake that costs a life," he murmured. Madame Chabrol's eyes flickered with something faintly resembling fear, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. She lifted her chin slightly, trying to regain control, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. "It was ruled a heart attack," she said, the words crisp but with an edge of uncertainty. Marrow frowned, his disbelief evident. "And you don't believe that?" Madame Chabrol averted her eyes, her gaze drifting toward the window, as if the city beyond could offer her some form of solace. "All I will say," she replied, her voice dropping even lower, "is that before my husband died, he warned me. He told me to leave Paris, to disappear." There was a brief pause, as though the weight of her confession was too much to bear. "So I did." The simplicity of her words struck Pooh like a sudden blow. "And now," he said slowly, his fingers steepling in thought, "after all these years, you find yourself at Hotel Bonn at the same time as Felix Rubino. A coincidence, madame?" She was silent for a long moment, the tension between them thickening with every passing second. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, as though afraid to be heard. "Rubino found something," she said, the words laced with an urgency that sent a chill through the room. "Something he was never meant to find." Pooh and Marrow exchanged a glance, the pieces of the puzzle starting to fall into place, but still, there was so much left unknown. "And now?" Pooh prompted softly. Madame Chabrol's eyes dropped, her hands trembling ever so slightly. "Now, he is gone, just a shadow in the hallway, slipping away like he never existed." A sudden noise from the corridor outside broke the tension, an unmistakable creak of floorboards. Pooh's head snapped toward the door, his body on high alert. Marrow was quicker, moving swiftly to fling the door open, but the hallway was empty, the air still and silent. Pooh stepped out into the corridor, his sharp eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. It was then that he saw it, a cigarette stub, still smoldering near the door. A small satisfied smile curved his lips. "Ah, mon ami," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "Our listener has returned." Marrow clenched his fists in frustration, his jaw tight with anger. "Whoever it is, they're watching us, keeping an eye on everything we do." Pooh turned back toward Madame Chabrol, his expression shifting to one of cold calculation. "Which means, madame," he said, his tone now icy, "someone is determined to stop you from telling us the truth. And that, I must say, makes your story all the more intriguing." Madame Chabrol said nothing, but the flicker of fear in her eyes was unmistakable, a moment of vulnerability she couldn't hide, no matter how hard she tried. Marrow exhaled sharply, his voice tight with frustration. "What now?" Pooh's lips curved into a small knowing smile, the kind of smile that spoke of someone in control. He straightened his tie with deliberate slowness, his mind already set on the next step. "Now we set a trap," he said, his voice smooth, almost serene. "Rubino uncovered something, something that terrified him. And now we know two crucial things. First, his disappearance is tied to powerful men, figures who would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. And second, one of our hotel guests is watching us, listening, afraid of what we might uncover." Marrow's jaw tightened, a mixture of determination and anger in his gaze. "Then we set a trap," he affirmed, his voice filled with resolve. Pooh's smile deepened, the air around him thickening with a sense of anticipation. "Ah, mon ami," he said, his tone almost playful. "You know me so well." He straightened his jacket, his eyes gleaming with the promise of what was to come. "It is time to catch our spy." That night, as the hotel grew still, the shadows lengthened, and the corridors of Hotel Bonn took on an eerie, almost haunted air. The only sound was the occasional creak of wooden floorboards, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Pooh stood by the window of his suite, staring out at the moonlit courtyard below, his mind calculating every move, every possibility. Behind him, Marrow paced with restless energy, his thoughts just as sharp. "Are you certain this will work?" Marrow asked, his voice low but urgent, barely more than a whisper. Pooh turned to face him, a small satisfied smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Mon ami," he replied, his voice cool and confident, A guilty mind cannot resist the pull of curiosity. And curiosity, he added with a knowing look, is our greatest weapon. Pooh and Marrow sat in the dimly lit suite, the tension palpable between them. The air was thick with the weight of secrets, each moment more pressing than the last. Someone's been listening, Manami, Pooh murmured, his voice low but laced with certainty. Our every move, every word, they've been watching us. We know it now. Twice, we've found those rare cigarette butts outside our door. Cast number 5 too expensive for just anyone. Marrow's eyes narrowed, his thoughts sharp as a knife. So, what's our next move? He asked, leaning forward. Pooh's lips curled into a subtle smile, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the chase. We bait them. We set a trap they cannot resist. Marrow raised an eyebrow. And what are we pretending to discuss this time? Pooh paused, savoring the moment. Felix Rubino, he said, his voice quiet but carrying an ominous weight. We'll make it seem like we've found the exact location of his hiding place. Something so vital to the case. Our watcher won't be able to resist eavesdropping. Marrow chuckled softly, a glimmer of understanding crossing his features. That'll draw them in, all right. Pooh adjusted his cufflinks, his fingers moving with deliberate precision as he met Marrow's gaze. Exactly. We give them just enough to act. And when they do, we'll be ready. An hour later, Pooh and Marrow sat in the suite, their voices low but deliberately loud enough to reach the ears of their unseen audience. Rubino left behind a message, Pooh said with careful emphasis, his voice full of mock intrigue. A note, hidden in his room, one that no one noticed. It holds an address, and by morning I'll have confirmation. Marrow's expression was the perfect blend of skepticism and curiosity. So you've already sent a telegram, he said, playing his role to perfection. And if someone here is trying to stop us from finding Rubino? Pooh's voice dropped to a near whisper, the tension growing thick in the air. Then Manami, we'll know exactly who that person is. The silence in the room grew heavy, the only sound the steady ticking of the mantel clock, then the faintest creak of floorboards. Pooh's gaze snapped to the door, his instincts on high alert. Someone was there, just outside. He held up a finger to his lips, signaling Marrow to stay silent. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then a soft rustle of fabric followed by nearly imperceptible footsteps. The figure was retreating, moving swiftly, but Pooh was faster. Marrow flung the door open, dashing into the hallway, where a shadowy figure was making a break for the staircase. Stop, Marrow shouted, his voice echoing in the hallway. The figure hesitated for only a heartbeat before sprinting towards the stairs. Without missing a beat, Pooh moved with surprising speed, cutting across the hall, blocking the other exit. You won't get away so easily, he called, his voice low and commanding. The figure skidded to a halt and turned, face illuminated by the harsh light of the hallway. Marrow's eyes widened as he recognized the person. It was Laurent Dupay, the journalist, his face ghostly pale, and breath coming in ragged gasps. His hands clenched at his sides, and he glanced between Pooh and Marrow, his chest rising and falling with barely contained panic. Pooh's expression remained cool, a knowing smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Well, Moo Dupay, he said, his tone laced with mock amusement. What an unexpected visit. Dupay swallowed hard, clearly rattled. I was just passing by, he stammered, his voice cracking. Marrow scoffed, crossing his arms. Twice we've found someone lurking outside our door, and now when we mention Rubino, you just happen to show up again. Not a coincidence, Moo. Pooh's voice dropped, becoming more serious. Tell me, Moo Dupay, he said softly. Why were you listening at my door? Dupay hesitated, caught between denial and the urge to confess. The silence stretched out, thick with tension, before he finally slumped, exhaling a long defeated sigh. Fine, Dupay said, his voice barely a whisper. I wasn't just passing by. I had to know what you were up to. His words hung in the air, thick with the weight of a secret he could no longer hide. "What were you hoping to hear, Dupay?" Marrow's voice was harsh now, the edge of suspicion cutting through the air. But before Dupay could respond, a soft sound echoed from the darkness of the hall. Another figure approaching. Pooh and Marrow exchanged a glance, their eyes narrowing, but neither moved. This was far from over. As the silence in the hotel hall deepened, a sense of unease hung heavily in the air. The flickering lights cast strange shadows along the dark corridor, their elongated forms crawling across the floor like something alive, twisting with the secrets they carried. Poirot, with his ever-watchful eyes, led the group. Inspector Dupay, trailing closely behind, his mind sharp, calculating, always 10 steps ahead. Laurent Dupe, the journalist, seemed less certain, his unease growing with every step closer to room 7. "I don't know about this," Dupay muttered, his voice thin with doubt. "The stories I've heard, the whispers about this room, strange noises, footsteps when no one's supposed to be here." His voice trailed off, eyes darting to the door, as though it might spring open on its own accord. Poirot's gaze hardened, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Legends are born from a kernel of truth, he remarked, with quiet intensity. "And truth often hides in places we least expect." Mudu's hand tightened around his coat, his thoughts a swirl of possibilities. He whispered to Poirot, the realization dawning that they were closer than ever before, to unraveling the mystery that had hung over them like a dark cloud. As they approached room 7's door, Mudu reached for the handle, only to find it locked. "Of course," he thought, a cold chuckle escaping his lips. "Too easy," he muttered. "It's never that simple, is it?" He knocked firmly, but the sound echoed back, empty and hollow. Poirot, ever the strategist, remained unfazed, his expression only slightly shifting. "It appears we need another approach." With a slight nod, he motioned towards the reluctant hotel manager, Gerard, who stood back, arms crossed in indecision. Gerard's brow furrowed, his face the picture of reluctance. "Are you certain this is necessary? This room has been empty ever since Rubino." His voice trailed off, as if the mention of Rubino's name held an unspoken weight. Poirot, however, was already steps ahead. "We believe this room holds the answers," he replied, with an unwavering tone, his eyes fixed on Gerard, with a quiet authority. With a sigh, Gerard pulled the key from his robe pocket, his fingers trembling ever so slightly as he inserted it into the lock. The door creaked open, the sound scraping across the silence, like the whisper of something old, something waiting. As they stepped inside, the musty air filled their lungs, a subtle chill creeping up their spines. Dupe hesitated at the threshold, his discomfort palpable, but Poirot and Mudu, without a second glance, each step a silent declaration that they were not backing down. The room, though dim, held an unsettling stillness, a stillness that felt too heavy, too wrong. They weren't alone. Something had changed, something had been left behind in this room, and it was only a matter of time before it revealed itself. The room was small, its elegance hidden beneath an oppressive layer of stillness. A large bed stood under a shadowed canopy. The writing desk opposite it seemed untouched, save for the faint scent of something distant, something not quite right. Elderberry, Poirot thought as he inhaled deeply, the scent hanging in the air like a subtle warning. Marrow blinked, caught off guard. "Elderberry," he repeated. Poirot's expression remained unreadable, a practiced mask of composure. "It's not important yet," he replied, his voice low, eyes already scanning the room, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Dupe shifted nervously, his eyes flickering around. "There's nothing here," he muttered, his voice betraying uncertainty. "No signs of a struggle, no blood, nothing unusual." Poirot moved forward without a word, his gaze sharp, as though reading the very soul of the room. He paused by the desk, his eyes tracing the edges of the floorboards with meticulous care. Suddenly, he knelt, tapping one of the boards with the tip of his finger. The hollow sound reverberated through the silence like a whisper. "Do you hear that, mon ami?" he asked, his tone soft but urgent. Marrow crouched beside him, mirroring his movements, tapping the board lightly. The hollow echo was unmistakable. Dub leaned in, curiosity piqued. "There's a compartment beneath," he whispered. Poirot nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Possibly. But we must be certain." With practiced precision, he withdrew a small pocket knife from his coat, the blade gleaming faintly in the dim moonlight. Slowly he slid the blade beneath the floorboard, lifting it with careful deliberation. The hidden compartment revealed itself, nestled within the dark crevice. Inside lay a small leather notebook. Poirot's hands were steady as he retrieved it, brushing away the dust. The leather was worn, its edges frayed with age. The initials F embossed on the cover. Felix Rubino, the man whose disappearance had set this whole mystery into motion. Marrow stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as Poirot opened the notebook, revealing hastily scribbled notes, calculations and dates, some underlined in frantic strokes, as though they held the key to something much larger. But it was the final entry that caught Poirot's attention, the ink darker, more frantic, as if Rubino had been running out of time. "I have uncovered the truth. They will not let me escape. I hear footsteps outside my door at night, watching, waiting. I must act soon before they do. I have hidden the key in the elderberry." The room seemed to hold its breath as Poirot read the words aloud. Marrow's frown deepened. "What does that mean? What key?" Dub, who had been standing in the corner, moved closer, his voice a low murmur. "Elderberry? Like the scent in the room?" Poirot's eyes narrowed, his mind already racing. "I believe Rubino hid something of great importance. We must find it before anyone else does." At that precise moment, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, a slow, deliberate pace, nearing the door. Marrow stiffened, his hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm. But Poirot raised a finger to his lips, signaling for silence. Dub, heart pounding, pressed himself against the desk, eyes darting to the door as though it might burst open at any moment. The footsteps halted just outside. The room seemed to pulse with anticipation. Then, a soft rustling, a metallic click. Marrow's eyes widened. Someone's trying the door. Poirot did not flinch. He waited, the handle turned slowly. Time stretched as they held their breath, waiting for the inevitable. A beat, then silence. Poirot counted in his mind. 5 seconds. 10. The footsteps retreated, their fading echoes almost eerie in their absence. Dub exhaled shakily, his hands trembling. "They know we're here," he whispered. Poirot's gaze remained steady. "We are not the only ones searching for Rubino's secrets now." Marrow's face hardened. "And they know we have his notebook." Poirot's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of impending danger. "Then let us ensure they walk straight into our trap." Felix Rubino's notebook, its brittle pages a testament to the frantic mind that had written on them, lay in Poirot's hands, the weight of its mystery pressing down on them. Inspector Moreau exhaled sharply, frustration and urgency evident on his face. "We should have gone after them," he muttered, his voice thick with tension. Poirot shook his head slowly, his gaze fixed on the notebook in his hands. "No, mon ami. They expected us to chase them. Instead we must focus on what they fear most." Dupre frowned, his eyes flickering between the two men. "And what's that?" Poirot's lips curled into a faint smile, his eyes gleaming with the promise of something hidden, something dangerous. "The truth," he said, holding up the notebook. "This, mon ami, is why Rubino disappeared. The answers lie within these pages. If we can decipher them, we will unlock everything." Marrow's expression darkened, and he grabbed a chair, sitting beside Poirot as the detective carefully turned the fragile pages. Dupre leaned over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the scribbled notes. Rubino's handwriting was erratic, almost frantic, sentences cut off mid-thought, numbers scattered across the page. phrases underlined again and again, as if the man had been trying to force them to make sense. The entries grew more desperate, more frenzied, as if Rubino was running out of time. "Let us begin at the beginning," Poirot murmured, his voice low as he began to read aloud. "March 3rd. They think I know nothing, but I've seen the figures. The money vanishes into shadows, yet no one asks questions. March 8th. Banff is not safe. I hear whispers. Someone is watching me. Should I go to the authorities? I need proof. March 10th. A key. The answer lies in the elderberry. I must hide it before they come for me. March 12th. Room 7. Footsteps at night. No one should be there, yet they return listening. I cannot trust anyone. March 14th. The final entry. Darker and more urgent than the rest. It is done. If anything happens to me, they must find the key. Without it they will never believe me. They must look where the elderberry lingers." Poirot paused, reading the last line twice, his expression unreadable. Marrow rubbed his forehead in frustration. "This doesn't tell us much. He mentions money. Was he uncovering some kind of financial fraud?" Dupre nodded, leaning forward. "It sounds like he was tracking something illegal. Maybe embezzlement. But what's all this about a key?" Poirot tapped the page, his eyes narrowing with a quiet intensity. "That, mon ami, is the most intriguing question. He has hidden something of immense importance, and it is connected to elderberry." Dupre frowned, clearly confused. "But elderberry, isn't that just a plant? A scent? How could it hide a key?" Poirot's lips curled into a small knowing smile. "Ah, but don't forget Marrow. Rubino was a man of secrets. He would not have left something so simple behind." Marrow stood, frustration mounting. "Then we need to check every bottle of elderberry wine in this hotel." Poirot raised a hand, his voice calm yet firm. "Patience, mon ami. First we must determine what kind of key Rubino was referring to." Marrow crossed his arms, eyes narrowing in thought. "You think it's a literal key?" Poirot tapped his temple, a gleam in his eye. "Or perhaps a metaphorical one?" He flipped through the pages again, his gaze sharpening at certain underlined words. "Money, shadows, proof, elderberry." Dupre leaned in, his voice low. "It sounds like he was collecting evidence of fraud." Poirot nodded slowly, his mind piecing together the puzzle. "Yes, but where? And why here? At Hotel Banff?" Marrow's fingers drummed on the desk, his mind racing. "This hotel is expensive, exclusive. A perfect place for people with something to hide." Poirot smiled, the expression both approving and knowing. "Precisely. Rubino was following a financial trail, a trail that led him here." Dupre pointed to the notebook, his face a mixture of curiosity and realization. "And this key he hid. Maybe it's for a safe deposit box." Poirot's expression sharpened, a glint of understanding flashing in his eyes. "An excellent deduction, mon ami. A key, not for a door, but for a safe, a locker, or perhaps a hidden document." Marrow nodded slowly, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. "So we need to find this key." Poirot closed the notebook with a quiet snap. "And we must find it before someone else does." His gaze swept over them, a shadow of something dangerous in his eyes. "And you think it's hidden in something related to elderberry?" Marrow asked, his voice taut with anticipation. Poirot's eyes glinted in the dim light. "I believe so, mon ami. The key is hidden in plain sight, disguised by the scent of elderberry." The air in the dimly lit cellar of Hotel Bonn felt thick, heavy with secrets, as Pooh's gaze moved across the rows of bottles lined up like silent sentinels. His fingers danced over the dusty labels before they froze on a row marked Vuro Elderberry. He motioned for Inspector Moreau, who nodded and stepped forward, grabbing one of the bottles to inspect the seal. The first was intact, pristine even, as if untouched by time. The second, too, showed no sign of tampering. But when Moreau reached for the third, his fingers lingered. "Wait," he muttered. "This one's different." Pooh stepped closer, his sharp eyes scanning every detail. The bottle was dusty. Yes, but there was something about it. A faint smudge, the imprint of a fingerprint, near the cork. "Someone's been here," Pooh murmured. Moreau took out his pocket knife, carefully cutting the seal. As the cork came loose, a sharp, sweet scent of elderberry mixed with oak filled the air. But it was what followed that caught their attention. A glint, small, metallic, caught the dim light. Moreau swore under his breath, his fingers trembling as he held the bottle steady. Pooh, with steady hands, tilted the bottle. A small brass locker key slipped out, resting in his gloved palm. "Rubino's key," Pooh said quietly, turning it over in the light. The key, small and seemingly insignificant, held a weight far beyond its size. Moreau's mind raced. "Now we need to find the lock it belongs to." Pooh nodded, his mind already racing ahead. "First we check the bank's safe deposit boxes. But there's another possibility." He glanced at Moreau, who raised an eyebrow. "The hotel's VIP storage lockers. Only Gerard, the manager, has access. If Rubino hid something, it could be there." Moreau rubbed his forehead. "Then let's find the truth." The trio, now armed with more than just a key, moved swiftly through the hotel's quiet halls, the corridors echoing with their footsteps. As they ascended from the wine cellar, the key in Pooh's pocket felt as though it had gained weight, as if the secrets it unlocked were already beginning to press down on him. Moreau spoke first, breaking the silence. "If Rubino hid something in those lockers, we need to get in now." Dupree hesitated, his voice low. "That area's restricted. Only Gerard can access it. And if he's involved..." Moreau's voice was harsh. Pooh raised a finger, his calm demeanor never wavering. "Patience, Monami. We approach delicately." Moreau scowled, his frustration mounting. "Delicacy? Rubino's dead because of this. We don't have time for subtlety." Pooh's lips curved into a small knowing smile. "Which is why, Monami, we won't ask permission." Moreau blinked, incredulous. "You want us to break in?" Pooh adjusted his cuffs nonchalantly. "Break in? How do you say? Criminal? No. We shall use our little gray cells." He tapped his temple. "The culprit will lead us there themselves." Moreau sighed, not satisfied with the answer. But Pooh's plan was already set into motion. They headed straight to the front desk, where the night receptionist looked up, his eyes heavy with fatigue. "Ah, Miss Pooh," he said, standing a little straighter. "How can I help?" Pooh leaned in, his voice warm but sharp with intent. "A small question, if I may. How many guests use the private storage lockers here?" The receptionist blinked, momentarily thrown. "Not many, just the wealthier clients, long-term guests mostly." Pooh smiled slightly. "And who oversees these lockers?" The man answered without hesitation. "That would be Miss Gerard, the manager. He keeps the ledger, tracks who rents which locker." Pooh's eyes narrowed. "And if someone needed access at night?" The receptionist frowned, the thought clearly bothering him. "That would be highly irregular, Miss Pooh." But he trailed off, suddenly unsure. Pooh's eyes gleamed. The pieces were falling into place. "Thank you." The game was on. Pooh let out a long dramatic sigh, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "Ah, how fortunate this is," he murmured, almost to himself. "I had hoped for just such an opportunity." He leaned in slightly, his tone taking on a more intimate edge. "Tell me, my good man," he said to the receptionist, who appeared increasingly uneasy under Pooh's piercing gaze. "Who has access to the VIP storage area at this hour?" The receptionist shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. His voice dropped to a whisper as he replied. "Well, Gerard handles the VIP rooms, but there's something strange I shouldn't be saying." Pooh's curiosity deepened, his gaze sharpening. "Oh, and what might that be?" The receptionist hesitated, casting a quick glance over his shoulder as if expecting someone to overhear. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely audible. Earlier tonight, Gerard had a visitor. A very persistent one, I might add. Poirot raised an eyebrow, urging the man to continue. Who was this visitor? He asked, his voice smooth, laced with intrigue. The receptionist, visibly torn, glanced down and whispered, Madame Elise Vauclair. At the mention of the name, Moreau's jaw tightened. Poirot's eyes gleamed with recognition as he turned to Moreau, a sly smile curling his lips. Vauclair, he muttered, as though tasting the name. The widow, the one who was seen speaking with Rabino before he disappeared. The puzzle pieces were clicking into place in his mind, but Poirot kept his thoughts to himself for the moment. How very interesting, he murmured, almost to himself. A widow, and a visitor in the middle of the night. What could be her purpose here? I wonder. Poirot turned to face Moreau, who was now staring at him with a mixture of confusion and growing suspicion. Do you not find it odd, mon ami? Poirot asked, his voice light, but carrying an undercurrent of something darker. Why would Madame Vauclair be in the VIP storage at this hour? Unless she's hiding something. Something precious, perhaps. Moreau frowned, clearly struggling to piece together the mystery. Poirot's lips quirked upward as he continued. Well, if she's already inside, why should we trouble ourselves with breaking in? We can simply join her. His eyes twinkled with a hint of mischief. Without another word, Poirot motioned for Moreau and Dupuy to follow him, and they descended swiftly but silently through the hotel's labyrinth and corridors. The path was narrow, lined with small numbered lockers, each one belonging to the wealthiest patrons of the hotel. Ahead, a single gaslight flickered weakly, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward them like dark fingers. It was here, in the eerie glow of the dim light, that they saw her. Madame Vauclair stood near one of the lockers, her back turned, fumbling with a small brass key. Poirot stepped forward, his voice polite, but carrying a note of authority. Bonsoir, Madame Vauclair. She froze. For a long moment she didn't move, and then slowly, she spun around, her face draining of color. The key she had been holding slipped from her trembling fingers, clattering to the cold floor. Poirot's gaze never wavered as he bent to retrieve the key, his voice cool and controlled. Forgive me, madame, but I cannot help but wonder, he said. What is it that you seek here at this hour? Madame Vauclair's eyes darted nervously toward the locker she had been trying to open. I don't know what you mean, she stammered, her voice rising in pitch as she took a step back. Moreau, ever the skeptic, crossed his arms over his chest, his stance unwavering. You seemed in quite a hurry to open that locker, he said sharply. Is there something valuable inside? Madame Vauclair's hand fluttered to her throat, but her voice remained shaky. No, I'm just checking on my late husband's belongings, she claimed. Though her words lacked conviction, Poirot didn't react, his expression unreadable. Of course, he murmured. But then why is it that you're using a key that isn't the one your husband was given? The question hung in the air, and for a split second, Madame Vauclair's face turned an ashen shade of white. Poirot, ever observant, noticed the subtle shift in her expression. With deliberate slowness, he pulled the brass key from his pocket, the very same one from the wine bottle. Perhaps, he suggested softly, this is the key Rabino left behind. Madame Vauclair's breath caught in her throat, her lips parted in shock, but she quickly closed them, trying to regain her composure. I don't know what you're talking about, she managed to stammer. But Poirot wasn't fooled. He took a slow step forward, his voice almost tender. Madame, I believe you know exactly what I mean, and if you're here tonight, it's because you fear that someone else might find what Rabino left behind. Silence stretched between them like a taut wire. For a long moment, Madame Vauclair didn't speak, her eyes darting nervously between Poirot, Moreau and the locker. The tension was suffocating. Finally, without a word, she spun on her heel and made a break for the door. But Moreau was faster. In one swift motion, he lunged, grabbing her wrist before she could flee. She struggled against his grip, but he held firm. Poirot, ever composed, observed her with cool detachment. "Madame, whatever is inside that locker," he said softly, but with unmistakable weight. "It was worth a man's life, wasn't it?" Madame Vauclair's breath quickened. Her eyes flicked between Poirot and Marot, her fear now a palpable presence in the air. Poirot remained calm, almost pitying, as he approached the locker and carefully inserted the brass key into the lock. A sharp click echoed through the narrow hallway, and the locker door creaked open. Inside, nestled among dusty files, lay a thin, yellowed envelope. Poirot took it gently, turning it over in his hands. The envelope was sealed with a stamp bearing the insignia of a prestigious bank. On the back, written in Rabineau's unmistakable handwriting, were the words "For the authorities." Proof of their crimes. The weight of the moment settled over them. Marot exhaled sharply, his features darkening. Madame Vauclair closed her eyes, as though resigning herself to the inevitable. Poirot's voice was soft, almost regretful, as he looked at her. "It seems, madame, that your secrets are no longer yours to keep." The silence in the dimly lit VIP storage room was oppressive, the air thick with tension, as Poirot held the yellowed envelope in his hands. The envelope, though unassuming in appearance, carried the weight of Felix Rabineau's final desperate gamble. The very proof of a conspiracy that had been years in the making. A secret so dangerous that it had cost a man his life. Madame Elise Vauclair stood motionless, her chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths, her eyes wide with fear, as if the walls themselves might close in on her at any moment. Inspector Moreau and Laurent Dup stood flanking her, their expressions hard as stone, their eyes locked on her every move. Poirot turned the envelope over slowly, his fingers tracing the edges with a deliberateness that seemed to stretch the moment into eternity. "Madame Vauclair," he spoke softly, his voice like ice, "if Rabineau's notes are to be believed, this evidence could unravel a vast web of deception. Yet, you have fought so hard to keep it hidden." The words hung in the air, pregnant with the implication of her complicity. Madame Vauclair's lips trembled, her voice a mere whisper. I didn't know. Not for certain, at least. I only suspected." Marot stepped forward, his voice sharp, cutting through the charged silence like a blade. "You might as well come clean, madame. We've caught you red-handed. There's no point in pretending." She swallowed, her throat tight with the weight of unspoken truths, her fingers twitching at her sides. Poirot inclined his head slightly, his gaze unwavering, a quiet understanding passing between them. "So you admit it? You knew," he murmured, his words edged with both curiosity and pity. Her hands clenched, and she lowered her eyes, as though the weight of her own guilt had become too much to bear. "I was only trying to protect myself," she whispered, a flicker of fear crossing her face. Poirot's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to a near silken whisper. "But from whom, madame? Who were you protecting yourself from?" She hesitated, a fleeting shadow of terror flickering in her gaze before she managed to speak, her voice shaking. "They're dangerous. Much more than you know. If I speak, I'm as good as dead. You don't understand. They have eyes everywhere. They'll make sure I disappear." Poirot's voice cut through the air, incredulous and firm. "Then why not let us protect you? If you help us, we can keep you safe. You'll be far better off than trying to go it alone." Madame Vauclair's eyes darkened with dread. "You don't understand. You think the law can protect me. You don't know who we're dealing with." Poirot's expression remained cool, implacable. "Then help us understand. Start at the beginning. What did Rabineau uncover?" The room seemed to hold its breath as Madame Vauclair's lips parted, her voice breaking the silence in a soft, hesitant murmur. "A web of lies. I met Felix Rabineau 3 years ago. At first he was just a financial consultant. But there was something about him. He was sharp, too sharp. He started noticing things that didn't add up in the accounts." Marot leaned in, his gaze intent. What accounts? She exhaled, her face hardening with the weight of her memories. The accounts of wealthy clients, investors tied to Hotel Basel. Money was being funneled through false corporations, laundered through high-stakes gambling, and then reinvested under different names. It was a full-scale racket. Poirot bawled under his breath. That's huge. But why keep it hidden? Why not go straight to the authorities? She let out a bitter laugh, the sound harsh and bitter. You don't get it. These people, they control everything. If Rabino had gone to the authorities, he would have been silenced long before he ever had the chance to expose them. Poirot watched her closely, his eyes calculating. And Gerard, the hotel manager, was he involved? Madame Vauclair's face grew pale at the mention of his name. Yes, he was the one pulling the strings. He didn't know Rabino had figured it out. That was his mistake. After Rabino confronted him about it, everything changed. Poirot's voice dropped low, a hint of steel in his tone. Who did Rabino confront? Who was behind all of this? Madame Vauclair closed her eyes, and for a moment, the weight of the past seemed to suffocate her. It was Charles Gerard. He was the one running the operation. Rabino was planning to go to the police, but he needed one final piece of proof that would connect Gerard to the entire laundering scheme. Poirot's fingers curled around the envelope, his eyes flashing with understanding. This is the proof, he said softly. She nodded. Yes, the envelope contains ledgers, bank statements, and coded transactions, everything linking Gerard to the scheme. But he never knew where Rabino had hidden it. Poirot's brow furrowed in confusion. But if Gerard wanted it gone, why not destroy it? Poirot's gaze sharpened, and he stepped closer. Because, mon ami, Gerard had no idea where Rabino had hidden it. Madame Vauclair trembled, her eyes filling with tears. Exactly. Rabino confided in me once. He said if anything ever happened to him, someone would need to take it, to make sure it never fell into the wrong hands.
He trusted me.
Poirot's eyes hardened. And now, it's in ours. She nodded, her voice almost a whisper. But I fear it may already be too late. They know I have it, and they will stop at nothing to take it from me. Madame Vauclair sat stiffly in the dimly lit room, the weight of the envelope in her hands almost suffocating her. Her heart raced, each breath more erratic than the last, as the silence stretched, thick and palpable around the small gathering. Her trembling fingers brushed the yellowed edge of the envelope, the proof of her darkest fears contained within. Inspector Pooh stood just beside her, his sharp gaze never leaving her face, while Marot and Dup stood like silent sentinels, the air crackling with tension. Madame Vauclair, Pooh's voice was low but piercing, a quiet force that left no room for escape. You wanted to protect yourself, but you've put us all at risk by hiding this. This evidence, what you've tried to bury, could bring everything crashing down. His words hovered, sharp and unforgiving. The room held its breath as Madame Vauclair swallowed hard, her lips dry, not a word escaping. Marot stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension. So you knew about this? His question was a sharp blade. She flinched, her voice barely a whisper, but the truth seeped out nonetheless. I suspected, she admitted, her hands trembling, but I didn't know for certain until tonight. Dup's eyes darkened, frustration simmering beneath his calm exterior. Then why come here? Why risk it all? Vauclair's bitter laugh cracked through the strained atmosphere. Because, she began, her voice faltering as she spoke of a terror too real to ignore. I couldn't trust anyone else. These people are dangerous. They have eyes everywhere. Pooh's gaze sharpened, intense yet measured, as he pressed on. Then you knew what Rabino had uncovered. Why hide it? She hesitated, her mind clearly torn between survival and guilt. Rabino. He found it. He uncovered the laundering, the fake accounts, everything. But he didn't get far. He was going to the police, but he said he needed something more. The words lingered in the heavy air, each one a revelation that tightened the grip of the trap around them. Who did he confront? Pooh asked softly, though his eyes never left her. The name slipped from her lips like poison. Gerard. The room seemed to grow colder at the mention of the hotel manager's name. Marrow's curse was barely audible, but it was enough to understand the danger Rabineau had walked into. And then? Dup asked, his voice a mixture of curiosity and dread. Rabineau was scared, she continued, her voice shaking. He said he had one final chance, one last piece of proof, but when he went to meet with Gerard, she trailed off, eyes lowered, as the horrible truth became clear. Gerard never knew where Rabineau had hidden it. Pooh stated quietly, his voice filled with understanding. But now we know. Vauclair nodded slowly, the weight of the secret threatening to crush her. This envelope, she whispered, contains everything. Ledgers, bank statements, and transactions linking Gerard to the money laundering operation. Dup frowned, trying to piece the puzzle together. If Gerard wanted to keep it hidden, why didn't he destroy it? Pooh's gaze was calculating, sharp as a razor. Because Manami, he said. He didn't know where it was. He doesn't know how close we are. A long pause stretched out. Then what? Dup asked, his voice tinged with urgency. Now we have to act, Pooh said, his lips curling into a small dangerous smile. But not recklessly. Gerard must believe he is safe before we expose him. He turned to Vauclair. You will help us, won't you, madame? It's the only way to survive. She met his gaze, her fear mingling with a spark of defiance. What do you need me to do? She whispered. We need you to set the trap, Pooh replied, his eyes gleaming with a calculating light. The plan had begun. The next morning, the hotel was still, save for the few scattered sounds of early risers moving through its marble halls. In the grand lobby, Pooh stood motionless, his cane resting lightly in his hands, his thoughts already several steps ahead. Marrow, beside him, glanced at his watch, irritation flickering in his eyes. You're certain this will work? He asked, though doubt lingered in his voice. Pooh's smile was small, knowing. Of course, Manami, he said calmly. A rat is never more vulnerable than when he believes he is safe. Marrow exhaled, pressing for more. And if Gerard doesn't take the bait? Pooh's eyes twinkled with mischief. Then we shall make it irresistible. Dup, standing nearby, adjusted his tie with a quick tug, his expression unreadable. And Vauclair? He asked, his voice skeptical. Do you trust her? Pooh shrugged casually, his tone detached yet firm. Trust is a luxury, Dup. But I understand her. Right now, she fears the real criminals more than she fears us. That makes her useful. Marrow gave a long sigh, clearly not convinced. Then let's begin, he said, a finality in his words. And so, they set the trap. Gerard, the manager of the hotel, was a man of calculating poise, his reputation built on the foundation of power and control. When Madame Vauclair had requested a private meeting in his office, his instincts flared with suspicion. The man sat in his luxurious leather chair, fingers steepled before him, exuding an air of effortless authority. Madame Vauclair, he said smoothly, his voice oozing a dangerous charm. To what do I owe the pleasure? Vauclair remained calm, though the weight of the situation pressed down on her. I believe we have a mutual problem, Monsieur Gerard, she said, her voice steady, despite the tension coiling in her chest. Gerard raised an eyebrow, amusement flickering in his eyes. And what problem would that be? Vauclair exhaled slowly, knowing the dangerous game they were about to play. Felix Rabineau left something behind. Documents. Ledgers. I assume you already know about them. A flicker of something dark passed over Gerard's face, but it was gone as quickly as it came. He leaned forward slightly, feigning indifference. And where, pray tell, are these documents now? Vauclair allowed herself a small knowing smile. In my possession. Gerard's lips curved upward, though there was no warmth in his expression. How fortunate for you, he said, his voice too smooth. And what do you want in return? Vauclair took a deep breath, knowing this was the moment of truth. "I want a deal," she said, her words deliberate. "If these documents were to fall into the wrong hands, we would both be in danger. But I have no interest in involving the police. I only wish to ensure my own safety." Gerard's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied her, weighing her words carefully. "A deal?" he asked, his amusement now gone, replaced by something colder. "What exactly do you propose?" The trap was set. As the tension in the room thickened, Madame Vauclair's fingers curled around the edge of her chair, her breath shallow but controlled. Her pulse quickened under the weight of the moment. Every word she spoke calculated, measured. Gerard, his face a mask of feigned calm, leaned forward in his leather chair, eyes gleaming with something darker. "Tell me, madame," he said smoothly, his voice a silken trap. "Where are the documents now?" For a brief second, Vauclair's gaze flickered. Only a fraction of hesitation, but it was enough. "In a secure location," she replied, her voice steady, but carrying the weight of hidden knowledge. Gerard's smile didn't reach his eyes. "How fortunate for you," he mused, clearly not fooled by her veneer of calm. The clock ticked loudly in the silence, each second a beat of impending danger. She knew the stakes. Gerard was no fool, and her survival depended on playing the game just right. "You see," she continued, her voice tinged with a cool confidence, "I came to propose a deal." The words hung in the air between them like a fragile truce. Gerard's eyes sharpened, his amusement evident. "A deal?" he echoed. She nodded, the weight of her words now settling on her shoulders. "If these documents were to fall into unwanted hands, it would spell disaster for both of us. I'm not interested in playing the police's game, but I am interested in my own safety." Gerard's laugh was low, unsettling. "And what is your price?" he asked, leaning in, intrigued. Vauclair took a steadying breath, her eyes never leaving his. 100,000 francs, she said, each syllable crisp, clear. For a moment Gerard's face betrayed nothing. "And if I offer you nothing?" he countered, the threat hanging heavy between them. She didn't flinch. "Then I take the documents to the police," she said evenly, the finality in her voice undeniable. The smile that spread across Gerard's face was cold, calculating. "No, madame," he said, his hand already reaching into the drawer of his desk. The sound of metal scraping against wood chilled the room. Just as the revolver's muzzle began to glint in the dim light, the door burst open with a force that rattled the walls. Inspector Moreau's voice rang out, commanding and sharp. "Drop it, Gerard." Gerard's face twisted in shock, but there was no choice now. Slowly, his hands lifted in surrender. Behind Moreau, Poirot stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with a quiet, unsettling certainty. "I do believe," he said, his voice low and almost amused, "you've just incriminated yourself." Gerard's jaw clenched, his gaze venomous. "You set me up," he snarled, but Poirot merely shrugged, the motion casual. "Unnecessary deception, M. Gerard," he replied smoothly. "You see, I knew you would try to buy her silence if the documents were real, or silence her permanently if they weren't." A flicker of panic flashed in Gerard's eyes as he reached for his weapon, but Moreau was already there, his pistol aimed with practiced precision. "You have nothing," Gerard spat, but Moreau's smirk deepened. "Oh, I think we do," he said, pulling out a small recorder. "Your entire conversation is on here." Gerard's face drained of color as the truth set in. Poirot's smile was one of mock sympathy. "Gerard, you'll have plenty of time to reflect on your actions in prison." As Gerard was cuffed and led away, Vauclair exhaled, the tension leaving her body in a slow release. Poirot turned to her, his gaze steady. "You took quite the risk tonight, madame," he said softly. She met his gaze, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had no choice." Poirot's eyes glinted with understanding. "But you did have a choice," he mused. "And I wonder, did you truly want to expose Gerard? Or were you hoping to secure the documents for yourself? She stiffened at the question, her lips parting in a silent defense, but Poirot's smile only deepened. Secrets always have a price, he remarked cryptically. As Vauclair averted her gaze, Poirot turned to Moreau, his expression shifting to one of quiet determination. Come, my friend, he said, his tone laden with purpose. Our work is not yet finished. Moreau frowned, puzzled. What do you mean? Poirot clasped his hands behind his back, his mind already miles ahead. Because Gerard was only a pawn, he said softly, his voice filled with certainty. Moreau's eyes widened as the pieces began to fall into place. Poirot gave him a brief, knowing glance. Yes, the true mastermind is still out there, he said, stepping toward the door. And we're going to find them. His steps echoed in the hallway, as his mind raced through the final pieces of the puzzle. The game wasn't over yet. The air in the hotel's grand lounge was thick with an unspoken tension, heavy with the knowledge that the arrest of Charles Gerard was merely the first act in a much darker play. Though Gerard was in custody, Poirot knew the real mastermind was still lurking in the shadows, untouchable, so far. His fingers curled around the handle of his cup, sipping the hot chocolate as his mind danced through the labyrinth of clues, each one leading him closer to the truth, but not yet close enough. Across from him, Inspector Moreau paced restlessly, his frustration palpable. You said Gerard was only a pawn, Moreau muttered. So who is really pulling the strings? Poirot's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. Ah, that, my friend, is what we must uncover. The words were calm, but Poirot's mind was anything but. The game had just begun. As if on cue, Laurent entered the lounge, his face set in grim lines. We've gone through Gerard's office and personal records, Jadid reported, his voice tight. There's no direct link to anyone higher up. Poirot nodded slowly, as though he had anticipated this outcome. Of course, he said, his voice smooth. The true villain would never be so careless. Deepa sighed heavily, his frustration mirroring Moreau's. So how do we find them then? Poirot set his cup down with deliberate precision, his eyes glinting with a spark of genius. We do not find them, mon ami, he replied, his tone cool and knowing. We let them reveal themselves. Moreau frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. How? Poirot's gaze sharpened, a glimmer of anticipation in his eyes. By making them think they have already won. The plan was set into motion swiftly. The three men gathered in the secluded corner of the hotel's library, the dim light casting long shadows over their faces as Poirot laid out the next steps. We shall let news of Gerard's arrest spread, he began, his fingers steepled together in quiet contemplation. The mastermind will believe they are safe, that the game is over. But they are wrong. Then Poirot paused for emphasis. We make them panic. Deepas raised an eyebrow, intrigued. How? Poirot smiled, a flicker of amusement crossing his features. By making them believe we have uncovered one last piece of evidence. A document in Rubino's possession. A document that names the true orchestrator of the crime. The idea hit Moreau like a bolt of lightning. A bluff? He asked, his eyes lighting up with the thrill of the game. Poirot's smile widened. Precisely. The mastermind will come for it, believing it to be the key to their freedom. And when they do, he trailed off, his voice filled with a quiet assurance. We will be waiting. The bait was set. That evening, Inspector Moreau made a calculated statement to the press, dropping the bombshell that new evidence had come to light. Evidence that could potentially reveal the identity of a higher figure in the criminal network. We are currently reviewing documents that may lead to further arrests, he said, his voice steady as the ripples of his words spread across the hotel. The reaction was immediate. Whispers erupted among the guests. Staff exchanged nervous glances, and the tension thickened in the air like a physical presence. Poirot, seated in the lounge with his usual air of cool detachment, observed it all with a sharp, calculating gaze. His mind was already 5 steps ahead, As always, a slight movement caught his eye. A figure, tall and elegant, moving swiftly down the corridor toward the hotel's records room. Poirot's lips curled in satisfaction. "There is our rat," he said softly, rising to his feet with fluid grace. "Come, mon ami. The final act is about to begin." As the figure entered the records room, Poirot and his companions followed quietly, the hunt now afoot. The mastermind, thinking they were in control, had just made their move. The trap had been sprung, and Poirot knew they wouldn't get away this time. Silently, like shadows in the night, Poirot, Moreau and Dup crept through the dimly lit hallways of the hotel, their footsteps muffled against the thick carpets as they moved with deliberate precision. The soft golden glow of the wall sconces stretched long across the walls, casting eerie, elongated silhouettes that seemed to watch them as they followed the mysterious figure at a careful distance. Each step brought them closer to the truth, their senses heightened, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on their shoulders. At last, the figure, tall and swift, slipped into the hotel's records room. Poirot raised his hand, signaling for complete silence as they approached. Inside, the faint rustling of papers echoed, followed by a sharp curse. Poirot's lips curved into a thin, knowing smile, and with a brief nod to Moreau, they sprang into action. Moreau, with a swift motion, kicked the door open, his voice booming through the stillness. "Freeze!" A gasp cut through the tense air as papers fluttered to the ground. And there, standing frozen in the act, was Madame Colette Marchand, the hotel owner. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as the woman's eyes widened in shock. Poirot's gaze never wavered, his expression calm and calculated. "Of course, mon ami," he said, coolly, stepping forward. Who else could have orchestrated such an elaborate scheme? Moreau's face drained of color as the realization hit him. "She's the one," he whispered, eyes flicking toward Poirot for confirmation. Madame Marchand stammered, her voice shaking. I don't know what you're talking about." Poirot raised a finger to his lips in a gesture of mock consideration. "Ah, madame, you insult my intelligence," he said, his voice a smooth whisper. "You came here tonight hoping to retrieve the so-called evidence we claim to have. But," he paused, letting the weight of his words sink in, "there was no such evidence." Dup, ever quick to act, bent down to pick up the papers Marchand had been so desperately searching for, documents related to Rubino ledgers. Poirot's gaze never left her as he spoke again, his voice chilling. "You were looking for Rubino's ledgers. He discovered your illegal financial dealings, money laundering, fraudulent accounts. When he threatened to expose you, you had him killed." Marchand's eyes darted around the room, her mind racing for an escape, but it was too late. "You can't prove anything," she spat, a last-ditch attempt to cling to her freedom. Poirot's smile remained cold. "Oh, but I already have," he said, his voice steady as a knife's edge. The game was over, the truth was out. Later, seated in the hotel lounge, Poirot recounted the case's conclusion to Moreau and Dup. "It was always her," he said, sipping his tea with a calmness that contrasted sharply with the tension of the moment. "Rubino discovered her money laundering operation, and when he threatened to expose her, she decided to silence him. Gerard was her loyal subordinate, and when he was arrested, she believed herself safe. But then," he added, eyes gleaming with satisfaction, "we introduced the fabricated evidence, and she panicked." Moreau let out a low whistle, impressed despite himself. "Clever," he murmured. "But what happens now?" Poirot leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled together as he considered the question. "Maron will face trial, and justice will be served," he said, with a quiet assurance. "As for me," he paused, a mischievous glint flashing in his eyes, "I shall do what I always do, rest, and prepare for the next mystery." With a contented smile, Poirot took a sip of his tea, savoring the moment of peace before the next challenge inevitably called to him. The game was over, but Poirot knew that mysteries never truly ended. They simply waited for the next one to begin.